Chapter 138. The silence in the hall lasted for a long time. Brendel looked at the white-haired youth who was clutching his wrist in disbelief, then looked at the sword that was still vibrating on the ceiling. He let out a sigh of relief. He was not surprised by this result. After the previous attack, Brando felt that this youth called Rady's strength was about 4 to 5 times that of a normal person, which meant that he had just stepped into the iron rank. It was the same level as when he was in the Golden Demonic Tree Canyon. This kind of strength was considered outstanding for his age, but it naturally could not be compared to his cheat code. Brando thought about his own strength. In this period of history he had indeed used a cheat code. In a week he had unlocked the first level of strength. In a month he had entered the iron rank, and in the 3rd month he had entered the silver rank. Even though it was not comparable to the Chosen, it was still unprecedented. As for whether there would be others after that, Brando could not say. According to the game's calculation, the silver rank would start from level 35. Brando estimated that he would need to reach level 40, which was about 600,000 experience points. And he had to store enough experience points in 7 months. Only then would he not miss the last train to Erwin's December Civil War. While he was thinking, he saw the crowd split into 2 sides. Amandina made a small sound of surprise. Brando was also slightly surprised, and then his gaze fell on 2 people at the back of the crowd. The one in front was a man wearing chainmail and a blood-red cloak. He wore a tall hat with colorful feathers on it. He looked like an explorer from Erwin's Royal Geographical Society, but the brooch on his chest was not the Royal Geographical Society's blazing amber, but a simple wooden medallion. The medallion was engraved with a kingfisher. The taller man in the back was wearing simple leather armor. The armor only protected the important parts of his body, so the muscles on his arms were exposed. He was carrying a huge sword that was at least 5 feet long on his shoulder. His forehead was wide, but his cheeks were deeply sunken as if they had been cut by a knife. He pursed his thin lips, giving people the impression that he was not angry, but he was imposing at first glance. When Brando saw this person, he could not help but be stunned. Isn't this that guy? Brando could not help but have a little doubt in his mind. Because of this tall man who looked like a barbarian from the snowy highlands, the moment he saw him, he immediately sketched out an image in his mind. A Rex Crosshand Buga, the trusted aide of Duke Lone, the captain of the guards of Lantanisland Castle. Arek was one of the 3 most famous swordsmen. He was one of the great swordsmen on par with Devard the Eagle and Sylvia the Silver Knight. Brando knew this guy because he was a famous character in the game in the past. As the guard captain of Lantanisland Castle, Buga the Cross Hand was the initiator of Lund's main mission, Courage. Brando was one of the few players who had personally experienced the series of missions. In fact, he still had a vivid memory of that shocking battle. He remembered, that should be the last part of the mission. In the mission, the players had to help Buga kill one of the 12 tree herders' patriarchs, the envoy of sorrow, Furnica. Furnica was level 97 and had mastered the highest level of the superior element, darkness. He had almost perfected his bronze body. In fact, in the era when the player's level cap was only level 83, the 12 tree herders' patriarchs were basically undefeatable nightmares. At that time the story went like this. Buga carried the great sword, the legendary Arwen, on his back and led the players into the headquarters of the tree herders in the Lone Kingdom, the Forbidden Forest. Using the knight swordsmanship of the Scene School, he was also the only legendary existence who had mastered level 17 swordsmanship. The player's level cap was 13. He only needed 4 strikes to kill the envoy of sorrow, Furnica. Throughout the entire mission the players were like spectators. They only needed to help Buga block the monsters and stall for time. In fact, it was this battle that cemented Brando's decision to walk the path of a warrior to the end. He was only level 72 at that time, but later on he became one of the few pure warriors in Wond who had a silver body. Thinking back to that time and looking at Buga who was still in his prime, Brando was a little dazed. He didn't expect to meet him here. This was the future greatsword hero Buga. Of course, Brando didn't dare to confirm that Buga didn't have the same terrifying strength as he did in the future. But from what he remembered, Buga the Crosshand was already a student of the knight swordsmanship of the Scene School at the age of 17. Not long after that he got to know the Duke of Lone. But why would he appear in such a remote place? Why is he here? Brando had just thought of this when he felt Buga's gaze on him. You're using military swordsmanship? Buga's blue-gray eyes flashed with a faint light. His eyebrows were sparse and his eyes were dull and lifeless. But from his appearance, this future greatsword hero didn't look like a monster at all. But the aura he exuded told him one thing. This ordinary-looking man was definitely a terrifying beast. The more sensitive one's senses were, the more they could feel this. Brando stood there, his 3.7 ounces of perceptive sense was equivalent to a normal person being able to hear whispers behind a wall. He could also easily feel the flow of air. But at this moment, Buga gave him the feeling that he was a towering mountain, standing still and unmoving. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. He clearly saw that the other party was standing there alone, but he felt as if he was facing an impenetrable wall. Brando gulped, slightly surprised. In the game, one would need to be at least level 30 to have such an aura. If that's the case, doesn't that mean Buga has already awakened his elemental power? So young? He was shocked. Brando knew that Buga wasn't a chosen one, but this achievement was enough to make some chosen ones blush with shame. As expected of a monster. Are you from the army, or are you a young man from a garrison somewhere? There shouldn't be anyone with your strength in the militia. Buga raised his eyebrows slightly and asked. Brando's reaction wasn't out of his expectations. So far, Eek was probably the only one in the entire mercenary group who could remain unmoved under his aura. That young man could indeed be said to be a prodigy. Buga couldn't help but smile when he thought of Eek. But the smile disappeared as soon as it appeared, because Buga was still staring at Brando. In the whole of Erewhon, there were only 3 types of people who practiced military swordsmanship. Soldiers, militia, or garrison. Knight nobles mostly had their own family swordsmanship, while adventurers and mercenaries from all over the world, even if they were from the military, would add their own swordsmanship after being honed in battle. And this young man in front of him was obviously a student from the training camp. Buga's identity was special, so he knew all these things very well. But he didn't expect Brando to shake his head. No, actually my ancestor was a Highland knight. But I'm here alone without my squire. As you can see, I want to join you temporarily because it's beneficial for both of us. I don't have any other motives, and if I have any other ideas, that's all. He thought for a while and decided not to directly point out Buga's identity to avoid arousing suspicion. The man standing beside Buga, wearing an explorer's hat, heard this answer and showed a kind smile. We're more than happy to accept your suggestion, but you should understand that a mercenary group doesn't need burdens. Brando glanced at Buga and understood 80% of the situation. I understand, so please tell me who I want to spar with. I think I've already defeated someone, and according to the rules, there shouldn't be more than 3 such tests. As a player who spent most of his time traveling, Brando was as familiar with the rules as any scholar who studied them. Makarov and Buga looked at each other. Then the tall man took out his greatsword and said, "Then let me test you, young man." As expected. Brando couldn't help but take a deep breath. He looked at Buga's thin face, but he didn't feel nervous. Instead he felt excited. Alright, I wonder how strong Buga is now. But it's not a bad idea to test my strength against this future great swordsman. Brando couldn't help but feel excited. He raised his greatsword and felt every cell in his body burning. When he became a level 130 warrior, Buga had already passed away. In fact, one of Brando's biggest regrets was that he didn't have the chance to spar with the great swordsman in his heart before he matured. Buga was once his goal, and even though he awakened his silver body, he still missed the chance to spar with this great swordsman. However, he didn't expect that when time returned to this moment, he would accidentally win another chance like this. Although he couldn't be considered a swordsman with outstanding swordsmanship, Brando knew that his understanding of swordsmanship wasn't inferior to anyone else. It was as if he had returned to the level 130 veteran warrior that he once was. He looked up, and his eyes were so bright that they seemed to be burning. The young man raised his greatsword. The level 10 military swordsmanship was no longer as simple as a high-level basic swordsmanship, and the natural aura it exuded was enough to capture everyone's attention. Brendel had seen such an aura from his grandfather before, but it did not cause people to feel as if they were about to fall into the abyss and fall into the abyss. But it was enough to stun the mercenaries. Great military swordsmanship. Buga's eyes glowed. You're qualified to spar with me. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 139. You do have what it takes to fight me. Just as the word fight came out of his mouth, Wuxia's greatsword swung over his head like a silver chain. There was a distance of about 10 meters between him and Brando, but in a split second, the heavy blade had already reached Brando's head. Brando did not need to look up to know how dangerous the attack was. It was as if 1,000 miles of mountains were collapsing on top of his head, and thunder was rolling down from the sky. Before the sword even reached him, the momentum was already overwhelming. This sword was at least at the peak of gold rank, but it was different from Ter's sword. Byuga's sword was thick and heavy, and the moment he struck out, it made people feel small and insignificant, as if they couldn't dodge it at all. Brendel had experienced such a sword before. Even though he did not experience it personally, but the mountain collapsing, tsunami-like momentum was the same as this time. He closed his eyes and raised the sword above his head. His forehead, shoulder, and left arm formed a solid line of defense. This was Erwin's most profound parrying technique. Erwin's military swordsmanship level 9. Brando hoped that this parrying technique, which had a 27% deflection rate in the game, would have the desired effect. He needed to be calm when facing Byuga's greatsword. The greatsword swung down and the two swords clashed. Dazzling sparks flew as the two swords collided. Brando's longsword bent backwards as much as possible. But it was not at its limit yet. The young man continued to adjust his strength, but Byuga's greatsword was like a giant boulder. The unparalleled strength of the greatsword penetrated into his arms inch by inch. He quickly realized that he could not retreat and he could not dodge. There was no way out. Brando's thoughts flashed like lightning, and his understanding of the warrior class flashed through his mind. Or rather, it was more like an instinctive reaction. He leaned back and slid to the side. Byuga's greatsword missed its target and hit the ground with a loud crack. The 5 wooden planks crumbled at the same time, and the wood splinters scattered like butterflies. Brando suddenly realized that Byuga was not using his full strength. This future Grandmaster Swordsman had exposed his trump card the moment he drew his sword. Byuga had already awakened his elemental element. His elemental element was earth, which was of a relatively high level. Otherwise, he would not have been able to comprehend such a vast and boundless sword will. Brando thought as he panted. The hall was completely silent. Although everything that had happened just now was like a fleeting shadow, and almost no one had seen clearly what had happened in the previous exchange. However, when they saw that Brando didn't seem to have suffered much of a loss, they couldn't help but hold back their exclamations. For a moment they didn't know what to say. Byuga's 70% attack was dodged by a swordsman who was only an upper iron level swordsman. What was going on? Those mercenaries who thought they were as strong as Brando couldn't help but put themselves in his shoes and think about what they could do under that level of attack. It was as if he could only close his eyes and wait for death. That attack just now, it seems like the vice commander used at least 70% of his strength. It's luck, right? Such exquisite swordsmanship. How is that possible? Whispers spread among the crowd, and the spectators all had different expressions as they looked at each other. However, the two combatants ignored them. Byuga raised his head and did not rush to pull his greatsword out of the ground. Instead, he looked at Brando in surprise. At first, he thought that Brando was just a young man with some talent, but he was used to seeing Eek's prodigy and didn't think much of the others. But now, Byuga realized that the young man in front of him was not simple at all. That slip just now was obviously a profound technique. Byuga's guess was not wrong. Brando's technique came from the long-lost swordsmanship of the fallen elves, the movement technique of the shadow sword. This swordsmanship focused on dexterity and agility, and its purpose was to attack the enemy without defense. That was why Brando used it to deal with Byuga. Unfortunately, Brando did not dare to hope for that swordsmanship. According to his experience in the game, Won should be in the first chapter of the game, The Empire of Birth, which talked about the rise of Madara. Unearthing the ancient texts would have to wait until the third chapter, Ancient Legacies, and those ancient swordsmanship would only appear in the light of day at that time. Seeing that Byuga stopped attacking, Brando sighed in relief. He swung his arm, but he did not feel any soreness or numbness. This meant that Byuga had maintained his strength at the same level as him. His heart suddenly skipped a beat. Since Byuga only treated this battle as a test, then he might have a chance to turn the tables. Brando was eager to give it a try. If Byuga maintained his strength at the same level as him and tried to defeat him with only his understanding of swordsmanship, then he would be digging his own grave. Who was he? Even though level 130 wasn't the strongest player in the Amber Sword, it wasn't something that the current Byuga could compare to. Brando's character in the game had used 17 different swordsmanship in the past 100 years, and more than half of them had reached level 10. As for the swordsmanship that he had seen and fought against, there were countless of them. Byuga's swordsmanship came from Sean's Night School of Swordsmanship, which was how he got his nickname, Crosshand. Coupled with his own understanding of the earth, swordsmanship, that kind of majestic strength combined with the momentum of 1,000 caddies, it was enough to capture the opponent's attention before the sword was even drawn. Unfortunately, this set of swordsmanship had no effect on Brando. He even knew that he would not fall into his opponent's rhythm, so before Buga could draw his sword, he had already taken the initiative to attack. The move was simple, Erwin's military style of swordsmanship. However, this stab gave everyone a fright. Especially those who had already learned Erwin's military style of swordsmanship. Swordsmanship was just a beginner's technique, Erwin's military style of swordsmanship level 0. Many people had learned it and practiced it repeatedly, but they could not imagine how a sword could cross a distance of 5 meters in an instant. Brando saw a flash of surprise in Buga's eyes, and he could not help but laugh in his heart. It seemed that although this future Grandmaster swordsmanship was an intermediate-level swordsmanship, the level of his swordsmanship had not reached a certain level. After all, at this point in time, Buga was at most 50 or 60 years old, which was the period of his growth. It was normal that his swordsmanship had not reached the level of a master yet. But if that was the case, then he would not understand how terrifying a master swordsmanship could be once it surpassed level 10. Erwin's military style of swordsmanship had a range of 1.5 meters, and with the master's bonus, it could reach 3.5 meters. However, Brando knew a few tricks, and 5 meters was the result of him deliberately hiding his strength. Otherwise, it would not be impossible for his sword to cross 7 meters. Of course, when his swordsmanship reached level 20, the bonus of a Grandmaster swordsmanship would be monstrous. Above Grandmaster there was the legendary threshold of level 30, but Brando had only heard of it and had never seen it with his own eyes. In any case, his sword was as fast as a shooting star. It was so fast that the surrounding mercenaries forgot to boo. At this time, Buga did not have time to withdraw his weapon. After a slight pause, he noticed Brando's intention and could not help but laugh. In his opinion, a swordsman should not rely on such petty tricks to fight against enemies. But since Brando insisted, he subconsciously prepared to teach this young man a lesson. Unfortunately, Buga immediately realized that it was not the case. Brando's sword seemed to have come alive. It was obviously a simple thrust, but after withdrawing his sword, he should have taken another step and used the hilt to strike his opponent. Then he would turn around and strike again. Brando thought so too, but at the last moment, Buga saw him change direction 3 times and directly thrust his sword towards his chest. Buga was slightly startled. He had no choice but to withdraw his sword and move sideways. But Brando seemed to know what he was going to do. His sword was already waiting in front of him. This future Grandmaster swordsman was shocked and could only retreat again. But once he retreated, it was not over because Brando followed up with another 3 swords and a sudden thrust. After another thrust, Buga could no longer hold back. He was very familiar with Erwin's military swordsmanship, but he had never seen anyone use Erwin's military swordsmanship like this before. But Brando was able to use it methodically and with such brilliance. Buga swore that in this country, there was not a single infantry manual that described the techniques of this swordsmanship. But now this young man was telling him that it was possible. This was a technique that countless warriors had come up with. Its techniques had long surpassed Erwin's military swordsmanship, and most of the NPC instructors had recommended the basic attack routes and routines. In the past 30 to 40 years, players had begun to summarize the essence of battle tactics, and they finally realized that they did not need to blindly follow the system's instructions. The innovation of techniques had begun. And now, Buga was facing the new Erwin's military swordsmanship that the players had laid the foundation for 30 years later. And in this, there was Brando's own experience as a Grandmaster swordsman. That was why when Buga entered Brando's rhythm, he immediately felt the pressure. The young man in front of him seemed to know his every move, and he himself was at a loss. It felt like a novice swordsman facing off against a master swordsman. Buga suddenly recalled what happened when he first started learning swordsmanship. It was not a difference in strength. It was a difference in technique. This future Grandmaster swordsman was forced back 7 or 8 steps by Brando, and he could not even touch the edge of his own sword. He could not take it anymore, and if this continued there would be no result. In the end he had no choice but to use his full strength. He directly used his elemental power to block Brando's attack. Dang! A loud sound rang out. This time, Brando was finally unable to defend himself, and he was sent flying back 10 meters into the crowd. The hall was silent. No one even remembered to cheer for this attack. The mercenaries only had a dull thought in their minds. What kind of swordsmanship was that? Was this what Erwin's military swordsmanship looked like? How high was this young man's talent in swordsmanship? Buga was almost unable to block a round of attacks? Could it be that I'm still asleep? No, this must be a dream. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 140. I didn't expect my lord's swordsmanship to be so high. Amandina praised without reservation as they walked. The only time she had the chance to witness Brando's full strength was at Bragg's underground auction, but she was busy running away with Roman and did not have the time to see how Brando dealt with the terracotta captain. The footsteps of the three people passed through the empty corridor inside the stone wall of the inn. A series of hollow sounds extended forward until the dark end of the corridor. The owner of the inn had carved stone windows into the rock wall to provide light. Looking forward, the natural light cast pale, faint spots of light on the dark floor at regular intervals. Yeah, Brando has always been very strong, Roman added with a little self-satisfaction. She narrowed her eyes with a hint of natural charm. She turned around and glanced at Brando with a smile. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he was worried that she was planning something strange again. This worry was not groundless. Before leaving the forest city, Roman did not know her place at all. First, she pretended to be a merchant to visit the local nobles and investigate the market. Then, she secretly bought a map from the Brotherhood of Thieves from Magetan to Chablis. This could be said to be extremely daring, since privately drawing a map in this era was a risk of being hanged. Of course, this matter was carried out without Brendel's knowledge. If it wasn't for the fact that she could never hide anything from him, he probably wouldn't have known that she was secretly doing these little things by herself. Hiding a map, pretending to be a noble, and forging documents and documents. Brando thought that he had already disregarded the laws of this ancient kingdom, but he did not expect that Romain did not even care about the black cover of the kingdom's laws. Of course, Brando suspected that she did not even know about the existence of the law. But Roman was careful and cautious outside, and she was as smart as a little fox. She did not reveal anything at all. If Brando did not find her secretly counting money in the carriage, he would not have known that she had used these illegal methods to earn a small sum of pocket money. Of course, Brando had already warned her about this matter, but she accepted it humbly and agreed with a few words. Perhaps only Martha would know how much she listened. "What are you thinking about now?" Brando could not help but ask. "No." Roman hurriedly shook his head as if something was wrong. "Then why are you so nervous?" Brando's suspicions deepened, and he asked in a bad mood. "Are you nervous, Brando?" Roman touched her small face and asked curiously with her eyes wide open. "Don't try to change the topic. This trick of yours is useless against me, little Roman." "Don't call me that." Romain's eyebrows raised, but her eyes immediately. "Brando, can I go out by myself?" "Of course not." Brando flatly refused. He was not afraid that this beautiful little town of Chablis would be ruined by her, but he had other considerations. Today he fought against Buga in front of everyone and used his master-level swordsmanship to intimidate everyone. Even the maned wolf, Makarov, could not say anything about it. But that was only on the surface. After the hot-bloodedness of a warrior faded away, he felt that his thoughts had become clear again. In the past, it was normal for a single mercenary or adventurer to join an unfamiliar mercenary group during a trip. In fact, anyone could run into trouble during a trip and have to rely on others for help. Although the 314th clause of the mercenary contract rarely appeared in official contracts, it was not uncommon for a single person to join an unfamiliar group. Even though they were in a group on the surface, they were still working for their own interests. That was why, other than helping each other, there was not much meaning to it. Therefore, the written rules that stated that mercenary groups could propose tests for their members were actually just empty words in many cases. That was why Makarov the maned wolf and Buga's actions in the afternoon seemed to have a hidden meaning. Brando could even see the suspicion in the eyes of the middle-aged man standing beside Buga. But was there a need for that? He was a little doubtful. Then he couldn't help but think of the scene outside in the afternoon. From the words and actions of the young man named Eek, it seemed that the mercenary group's operation to suppress the bandits this time wasn't as simple as he had imagined. Do they have other motives? Or did they run into some trouble? That's what I want to know. He did not want these mercenaries to be after the same thing as him. That would be troublesome. Thinking of this, Brendel could not help but frown deeply. "What's wrong, Brando?" The Roman blinked. "Are you mad at me?" "Of course not." Brando glared at her. He knew that she was not afraid of him being angry. She was just trying to find a topic to talk about. "Amandina, what did they say they were from?" Brendel turned around and asked. He suddenly remembered something. This was a new question for him. The Grey Wolves mercenaries. Grey Wolves? Why, is there a problem? Amandina asked. Nothing. Brando answered casually and then muttered to himself. Grey Wolves mercenaries, Grey Wolves? Shouldn't it be the Blue Mountain mercenaries? That should be Makarov the maned wolf. That's right, the middle-aged man was exactly the same as the description. There should be no mistake. But why was the name of the mercenary group different? Could it be that there was a change in history? He raised an eyebrow. There was another possibility that the mercenary group had changed its name. But in this field, changing a name was not a small matter. Not to mention the fact that it had to be registered with the Adventurers Guild under the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was a tedious and huge project. Under normal circumstances, it would not be successful unless there was a huge change. Huge change? Brendel raised his head and looked at the ray of natural light that shone through the stone window in front of him. His dark brown eyes flickered with uncertainty. How is it? The red-haired middle-aged man touched the scar on his face and turned around to ask. Standing at a high place, the cool breeze caressed his face. He could not help but squint his eyes and stare at the town of Chablis. The town was like a man-made hill with a winding staircase going up the hill. The name, Maned Wolf, Makarov had been famous in the mercenary world for 6 or 7 years, and it was left behind when he first joined the mercenary world. It meant that he was brave and fierce, and he fought without any regard for his life. He was like a ferocious alpha wolf. Because in the southern mountains of Oween, the alpha wolf was also called a silver-maned wolf, hence the name. Buga put his hand on his forehead and smiled. That kid's military swordsmanship is superb, almost at the level of a master. Even in the army? He suddenly coughed. You know what I'm talking about. If we're talking about swordsmanship, I'm not as good as him. That young man called Brando is a true genius, born for the sword. It's hard for me to believe that someone of his age could have such a deep understanding of swordsmanship. Do you know, I can't even move freely in front of him, he smiled. Before I met young Master Eek, I never believed that there were geniuses in this world. A person can only reach that level through hard work. But after meeting young Master Eek, and especially after what happened today, I feel that I made a mistake. After saying that, he smiled, revealing his white teeth. You're comparing him to young Master Eek? Makarov turned around. The scar on his cheek was rumored to be from a battle with the Son of Night. But those who knew him well knew that he already had this scar before he became a mercenary. I don't think that young man has such skills. That's why you're the commander and I'm the swordsman. So, you have a very high opinion of him? Yes, but that young man reminded me of someone I know. Oh, a stubborn fellow. Let's not talk about that. I don't think that young man is a spy from paper cards. Buga said, if they have such a talented backup, everyone would know about it. Makarov shook his head and smiled. It's hard to say. This is a sensitive time. I don't believe that paper cards is here just to snatch a mission from us. Chablis is just a small town without much profit. How can it be so attractive? You said that before, didn't you? You think they have other motives? Buga asked. That's right. What are they after? Those lizard men bandits have other plans, or? I'm not sure, but Eek has been acting strangely for the past few days. Makarov closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I'm worried. I can't let a bunch of bastards follow us. The last mission was also because of them. This time I want to get rid of them once and for all. Buga looked at him. Grandmaster Eek agreed? Makarov nodded and shook his head. Grandmaster Eek didn't say anything. Then why don't we wait? We can't wait anymore. The tree herders are coming. Didn't you notice? Maned Wolf said against the wind. We'll leave in 3 days. What about that young man? Let him follow us. P.S. We're all civilized people, so please don't be rough with me. I'm already very pitiful equals. Chapter 141. Chablis July morning was a song composed with the chirping of the birds. When the first rays of the morning sun shone on the forest, the small town in the middle of the mountains was filled with vitality. The house that was decorated by the natives was filled with the scent of mint leaves. Brando woke up early in the morning. It seemed that after coming to this world, the habits of a swordsman overwhelmed the habits of a gaming otaku. Sleeping in seemed to be something that happened in the last century. Brando looked at the mountains of Chablis through the stone window at the side of the room. He pressed 2 of his fingers on the card and flipped it open with his thumb. The wind elemental crystal that was placed at the side immediately vaporized into green smoke and merged into the card. A small whirlwind blew in the small space, and a dimensional rift opened and closed and 20 wind spirit spiders shot out from it. Brando immediately gave an order. These little creatures that came from the wind realm immediately turned into mist with a series of squeaking sounds, and quickly turned into a cloud of smoke that floated out of the room. Seeing this scene, Brendel smiled and opened a mana potion. It seems to be a storyline quest. He frowned as he thought. This thought had caused him to be unable to sleep well for the past 2 days. It revolved around a dungeon, and after a certain period of time, a storyline would be triggered. These storylines were all deduced by the system, so it did not seem strange on the surface. In fact, the real-time quest system was one of the selling points of the Amber Sword. But in this world it seemed like the storyline of the game was reproduced in real life. I understand this point. Brando thought carefully and finally remembered something. It was something that was vaguely mentioned in a guide about the Balagon ruins a few years ago. It talked about the experience of the first party that entered the dungeon. It seemed vaguely familiar. But when he raised his head, his thoughts were interrupted. Knock, knock, knock. There was a knock on the door. It was definitely not a Roman person because this young lady did not know how to knock. She was not afraid of people saying that she did not have a good upbringing. It could not be Amandina either because she was always polite and would not be in such a hurry. Brando had already guessed that it was Makarov's people outside in the blink of an eye. Please come in. The door opened and behind it were 2 young men. One of them was the white-haired young man who looked as feminine as a woman in the afternoon the day before yesterday. He was looking at him with a sour face. The other one Brando had never seen before, but he guessed that he was about the same age as the former. He had short hair and looked a little skinny. He was looking at the room curiously. Mr. Brando, we are about to depart. You are? The short young man looked at him with curiosity, suspicion, and awe in his eyes. Obviously, Brando's battle yesterday afternoon had left a deep impression on the new members of the mercenary group. A young man in his 20s was able to fight to a draw with the deputy commander. This was what most of the young men thought. In the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Buga's strength was far above Makarov's, and that was a publicly acknowledged fact. In other words, this young man's strength was simply unimaginable at their age. He had also heard of the legends of the Chosen One, but no one knew how strong the Chosen One was. He couldn't help but look at Brando, wondering if he was one of the legendary Chosen One. However, Brando obviously didn't know what the young man was thinking. If he knew, he would have laughed out loud. In fact, with his current strength, he was still far from being a reverend, let alone a Chosen One. All right, thank you. He nodded at the young man without knowing anything. We will be there soon. But the white-haired young man immediately snorted. Brendel could not help but look at this guy. After yesterday's interaction, he already knew that this guy was a nobleman's son who went out to travel. It was no wonder he had such an arrogant temper. As for why he joined this mercenary group, it was probably another story. Anyway, he wasn't interested in knowing. But even if he didn't mind, it didn't mean that the other party didn't mind. The white-haired young man was clearly angered by being ignored. He couldn't help but snort and say, "Listen, although I'm not your opponent, I'll keep an eye on you at all times. Don't think you can play any tricks." The young man beside him was stunned. He obviously didn't expect his companion to say such words. He couldn't help but turn around and open his mouth, but he didn't say anything in the end. "Oh, you're called Rady?" Brendel scolded him in his mind, then raised his head and asked. "None of your business." The white-haired young man snorted. "Are all nobles so uneducated?" Brando asked. "You." The white-haired young man gritted his teeth and wanted to draw his sword, but when he thought of the difference in strength, he couldn't help but back down. "I heard Eek escaped? How did you know you?" Rady frowned and was about to question when he saw Brando's smile. He immediately realized his slip of the tongue and couldn't help but snort heavily. "You care too much, I'll tell the leader about this." Brando thought to himself. "Do you think everyone is an idiot like you?" But on the surface he still smiled and said, "I'm just asking. You know that I met Mr. Eek 2 days ago." Who knows? Rady thought. But even though he gritted his teeth in anger, he still deliberately maintained a cold expression. "I heard you and the Silver Sword St. Gory keys came from the same place?" Brando changed the topic. "And you?" The white-haired young man suddenly remembered Brando's previous ridicule and forcefully swallowed the words back into his stomach. In the end it turned into a cold snort. But he also realized that he couldn't get any advantage over Brando verbally, so he simply dragged his colleague away and left Brando alone. He thought to himself that it wasn't like this guy couldn't find his way, and it was better if he couldn't find his way. Brando couldn't help but laugh in his heart. That guy Gory Keys actually had admirers. Back then he learned the sword art called Heaven's Limit from Gory Keys. It was a pity that Gory Keys had 3 intermediate sword arts, Heaven's Sword, Thunder's Sword, and his self-created Heaven's Limit sword. But Brando himself didn't even get a single advanced sword art mission. Instead he was choked by that old guy's temper. This guy definitely didn't know that Gory Keys loved gambling, and his gambling character was extremely bad. Not only would he lose every bet, but he would also often not admit to it. But the sword art Heaven's Limit. Thinking until here he couldn't help but smile. With the previous experience this time would be easy. It was a pity that Gory Keys should still be traveling around Cruz, or else he would be able to find him right now. Buga and Makarov looked at each other in dismay. But in the end it was the mercenary leader called Maned Wolf, who couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Brando, these people are?" He pointed at the 12 mercenaries beside Brando. With Martha as the leader, the entire Chablis Lantern Grass and was under their strict surveillance. From the reports from the various hidden sentries, there were only ordinary guests staying in the inn since 3 days ago. However, these guys who were carrying a bunch of flying axes, javelins, large round shields, horned helmets, and sharp blades didn't look like ordinary guests at all, did they? Where did they come from? Brando obviously didn't understand Makarov's confusion. He shrugged and smiled, "They are my men. I remember I told you before that they are mercenaries that I hired. They came from a place far away. As a merchant I have to travel from place to place. These mercenaries came from a minority in the east of the kingdom, so please don't mind their attire," he said with a smile as if it was true. But Amandina and Roman looked at him. Romain thought with a simple thought that ordinary people could not understand. So Brando had connections with a minority in the east of the kingdom. He is indeed powerful. But Amandina's thoughts were not as simple as Romain's. She had long suspected where Brando's men came from. Even though she knew that Brando had a mercenary group, they should be in Irek's territory right now, and they shouldn't be from a minority. The Shire as well. Even though Brando told them that the Shire had returned to Karsuk, she still felt that something was wrong. But she could only bury her suspicions in her heart. She could not use it to question her lord. Even Brando's aides had doubts, let alone Makarov and Buga. These 2 historical figures were considered to have seen a lot of things, but they couldn't figure out what was going on. Because of Eek's escape, the sentries they set up were at least silver-ranked, but these iron-ranked mercenaries still managed to sneak in without anyone noticing. Makarov couldn't help but furrow his brows. His evaluation of Brando and his heart jumped 3 levels, and he became a little mysterious. "So, Commander Makarov, can we depart now?" Brando asked. "Of course." Makarov nodded with difficulty. He made up his mind to place Brando's group in the middle of the group and keep an eye on them to prevent anything from happening. He was originally full of confidence, but now he wasn't so confident anymore. A young man with outstanding swordsmanship who was close to silver-ranked, and 12 mercenaries who were at least silver-ranked, gave him a headache just thinking about it. He couldn't help but turn to Buga and grumble, "Old friend, this is the result of your investigation?" He couldn't help but ask. Buga shrugged. Makarov asked him to investigate the mercenaries that Brando mentioned, but he didn't find any clues after 2 days. He didn't expect these 12 people to appear out of nowhere. Even though they were only silver-ranked, he didn't believe it himself. He looked at the strange mercenaries and thought that they must have used some method to hide their strength. What is this? Are they living people? The future Grandmaster Swordsman couldn't help but roll his eyes. P.S. The reason why the update is slower than usual is because I have a cold =__=. On the last day of February, please vote next month. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 142. In the era of cold weapons, a war was often not as optimistic as people imagined. Before coming into contact with such a face-to-face battle, it was difficult for people living in a peaceful era to speculate about the pairs of eyes that roamed the battlefield, choosing people to devour. The battle was a touch of bone-chilling cold, how the cold, sharp, snow-white blade pierced the throat, causing blood to splatter and blend into the night. The dying man struggled with all his might, staring at the last scene he could see with a sad and powerless gaze. It should be a scene that gradually dimmed and stilled. Then, because the blood foam choked back into the lungs, the wounded coughed hoarsely, and curled up miserably as they died. But there were still many people who took the scene in the novel for granted and replaced it with a real battle, just like the first batch of players in The Amber Sword, and those who came after. Of course, at that time, Brando also had an identity called Sophie. He remembered that his first real battle in the game in the past unfolded comically and laughably. There was no battle formation as imagined, and the two armies faced off. It was in a similar forest, Del Tarson Forest. Brando still remembered that place. The dense jungle stretched along the steep and rugged coastline, and the opponent was hidden between the cliffs, playing hide-and-seek with the slave traders and their private army through the caves that extended in all directions. Because the real confrontation actually took place between the elite scouts, the large army of players drew a beautiful scattered line in the jungle in an orderly manner, and their number was about 3 times that of the slave private army or even a little more. But in a real confrontation, the balance of victory and defeat did not necessarily depend on the number of players. The beginning of the battle was accompanied by a one-sided chaos among the players, which was natural. The members and the organizers could not find each other, and most people could only form small teams and fight on their own. For several hours, the players' flanks were attacked, and the thousands of people in the middle were only delayed by a small group of cavalry. Yes, most people understood that the flanks were under attack. But the problem was, where were the scouts? Where were the flanks? When you put yourself in the shoes of a huge battlefield with a width of several kilometers, you would find that being able to overlook the entire battlefield from a 45-degree angle was not only a happy thing, but also an extravagant wish that you could only wish for but not ask for. Brando clearly remembered that he was in a forest surrounded by his own people. There were flags of the Union, the Personal, the Knight, the Squire, the Swallowtail flag, the Square flag, but no one knew what they meant. Most people, including him, could only follow the crowd and move forward blindly for a few hours. Occasionally they would encounter a small group of private slave soldiers. Everyone would swarm them like a hot knife through butter. At first, the players were in high spirits, thinking that victory was in sight. But in the end, if one were to look down at the battlefield, they would find that this huge army had already been torn apart. 2 to 3 teams of professional mercenaries were in the middle of this fragmented cake, gnawing away at its insides like maggots. By the time the sky darkened, the enemy's banners could be seen everywhere. Recalling that war, it was later nicknamed the Massacre of Dirtle. In fact, this name vividly described the situation of more than 1,700 players from the 3 guilds who had gathered together. There was no doubt that these players were brave warriors. Even in the end, they formed their own small teams and fought to the death. Of course, the result was complete annihilation. In fact, the real irony was that in the entire morning and afternoon, the damage done by the players was not as great as the damage done by the slave traders in the night. Brando thought back to that battle. Not only did he feel awkward, but he also felt cold sweat on his forehead. After that, until the Bucci War, during the Second War of the Black Rose, the players gradually learned how to set up the battlefield and what flags they needed. How to distinguish which knight's army belonged to which flag from the strange emblems. The players also learned to set up the battlefield on a flat slope under a high ground, so that their commanders could see the entire battlefield in a 10-kilometer radius. Just like the maned wolf, Makarov was doing now. Of course, the battle between mercenaries and bandits was far from a war. But the battle in the forest was similar. Brando tightened the reins to prevent the thick bushes from prickling the horses. He looked back and saw a few figures wearing green cloaks and holding a pomelo lacquer longbow. If it was a normal person, they would not have noticed them. Of course, they were not lizard men. Brando thought that the lizard men in the Balagon forest should be a branch of the jungle lizard men. Although their skin was covered in fine scales and was dark green, these short creatures were not as tall and burly as the Highlanders. There was no doubt that they were the best hunters among the Highlanders, the forest archers. This was the name given to them by the Cruz people when they invaded the forest. 200 years ago, this name was like a ghost in the forest to the Empire's soldiers, but to the Highlanders, it was a title of honor. It meant that they were the swiftest hunters, the most accurate archers, and the best rangers. I wonder where Makarov found these rangers. Brendel's fingers tapped on the metal ornaments on the reins as he thought to himself. He had heard of these best rangers of mankind before. In fact, in the past or perhaps in the future, he had fought side by side with these rangers for a period of time. Perhaps it was not a long time, but it was enough to leave a deep impression on him. Could it be that they have been roaming around this area for a long time? With an excellent ranger, the work of the mercenary group would be much easier. It was obvious that the maned wolf, Makarov, had a way of dealing with his opponents. In fact, Brando knew that in times of chaos, the mercenaries were more familiar with their opponents than the latter were with them. The members of the Grey Wolves mercenary group were like that. It was not their first or second time doing this kind of work. Hiring mercenaries to fight against bandits in the wilderness was a common thing, and the more famous a mercenary was, the more experience he had. And the maned wolf, Makarov, was definitely not a nobody. In Brando's opinion, if a player wanted to deal with a bandit group, the best way to deal with them was to uproot their nest once and for all. He looked at Makarov's arrangement and understood that his plan was not far from his own. However, they had another advantage. They had already confirmed the location of the Lizard Men tribe. It would take a lot of effort for outsiders to find the ruins of the Balagon Silver Elves, but it was a piece of cake for the Highlanders and the Highlanders. Brando was a little hesitant at first. He wasn't sure if he had to join them in this adventure. After all, he could hire someone to follow them and wait for them. But that was a little risky. Following behind a mercenary group could be seen as a serious provocation, and it might cause unnecessary misunderstandings. The young man didn't want to create unnecessary trouble, so he thought of using the mercenary contract. But now, it seemed like he didn't expect Makarov to have so many forest rangers. It was a pleasant surprise. Of course, it also reminded him that he didn't follow Plan A, or a normal guide wouldn't have been discovered by the forest rangers. He couldn't help but look at Makarov and Buga. The maned wolf, Makarov and Buga's faces were tense. They had no choice but to let Brendel see their forest-piercing archers, and it was just a deterrent. Brando's group of 15 was like a ticking time bomb in the middle of the group. But he couldn't put them in the front or the back because it was more dangerous. Of course, if he had a choice, he would definitely throw Brando out. In fact, Buga had given him this signal more than once. But in the end, he shook his head. He touched the scar on his face. The Grey Wolves mercenary group could not do anything that would betray the group's honor. Although many mercenary groups did this, including some famous large mercenary groups, their past was not that glorious. But he and Buga knew that their group was the same. The two men looked at each other and thought of Eek at the same time. Eek is still in town? Makarov asked. Buga nodded. Forget it, let him be. It's not his fault. The red-haired man shook his head and smiled bitterly. It's a pity that we can't tell him too much. He's doing it for your own good. He saw through paper cards, but he didn't know that we already knew. Drake was scheming against us, but that idiot didn't know that we were scheming against him. Makarov tilted his head in disdain, but the real problem isn't him, but the young man in the group. I'm sure he's not with paper cards, but that doesn't make me less worried. That's ironic, don't you understand? The maned wolf mocked himself. Buga felt the same way. But Brando didn't understand how much trouble his arrival had caused for these two future leaders. There were about 70 of them heading straight for the ruins of the Silver Elves. It would be best if they could ambush them, but if they couldn't, they would have to work for a few days. Eliminating bandits in the forest wasn't something that could be done in one go. However, as he rode on the horse, he was thinking about another matter. He thought about the strategy post on the forum, but he couldn't figure out when Makarov the maned wolf got involved with a mercenary group called Grey Wolves. Shouldn't it be Blue Mountain? It was a light purple flower that bloomed in the mountains of the south. What was the purpose of using that flower as the emblem of the mercenary group? He suddenly shook his head to get rid of this irrelevant thought, and a flash of light cut through the dark sky and sea. It was as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over him, and he suddenly remembered the connection between the name and the phrase. The Grey Wolves Mercenaries. Right, the Grey Wolves Mercenaries. Brando raised his head and felt that the forest around him was dyed with a strange color. It was just a simple bandit clearing mission, but now it seemed that something was wrong. Logically speaking, the Grey Wolves mercenaries had about 70 members. More than half of them were iron ranked and a fifth of them were silver ranked. There was also the forest snipers. Why would a group like that need a strategy to clear out 100 level 20 lizardmen bandits? But there must be something wrong with it. Brando had just taken a deep breath when he heard Amandina's question from behind. Why did you arrange for them to be there? This isn't normal. He didn't need to turn around to imagine Amandina's frown. What do you know, little girl? It was Rady's voice. Brendel's face immediately contorted into a scowl. P.S. If everyone is used to last month's stable update, I will be giving everyone a surprise this month. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 143. He turned around and saw the white-haired youth's frosty face. The next thing that entered his field of vision was a dozen of Judland's heavy infantry behind the forest. The Judland people were one of the most common mercenaries in Alwyn. It was as if the residents of the Abyssal Sea region were professional soldiers. In fact, this tradition had its origins. The 11 port cities in the Jedran region were at odds with each other, and the frequent wars gave birth to the profession of mercenaries. A typical Jedran mercenary would at least wear a fine and heavy scale armor, carry a flaming steel spear on their back, and a shield half the height of a person on top of the spear. A long sword and an axe hung at their waist. Those were the tools they used to make a living, and every Jedran person inherited that wealth from their parents. Brando did not even need to remember the background of the game as he was already familiar with it. What's going on? He pulled on the reins to slow down his horse as he asked. Those are heavy infantry. Sir, Amandina's beautiful black gem-like eyes hid a trace of vigilance. She turned around and answered, they placed the heavy infantry at the back. It's obvious they don't trust us. Brendel glanced at the back and suddenly had a hint of understanding. He smiled, it's normal for them not to trust us. But Amandina's question caused the white-haired youth to snort in dissatisfaction. Brando glanced at him and asked, then why did you place the Jedran mercenaries at the back? It has nothing to do with you. Rady replied curtly. Sir, it's like this. They are moving too slowly in the forest. The skinny youth tugged at his sleeve and answered, Mr. Makarov placed them here to prevent any unexpected situations. It's not that he doesn't trust you. I see. Two birds with one stone. Compared to you, your companions aren't very good with words. Brendel's expression was one of understanding, but he did not forget to tease her. Rady's expression immediately darkened and he left without a word, leaving the skinny youth behind with a bitter smile. Brando looked at the youth and asked, what's your name? My name is Sanford. Sanford doesn't sound like a local name? Because I was originally Bragg's baker apprentice. Of course, that was before I became a mercenary. The young man looked at them and asked, Sir, from your accent, it seems that you are also from there. I'm not, but they are. Brando gestured with his chin towards Amandina and the Roman lady. Sanford smiled shyly as he looked at the girl riding beside Brando. But Amandina turned her head to the side and did not look at him. She was still a noble after all. Even though she was down and out, the arrogance of the Erewhon nobles still flowed in her veins. She did not want to interact with a commoner. However, the Roman didn't have this concern. The merchant girl winked at the young man. She was from Bucci and could be considered as a fellow villager. That's right, it's explainable. But bringing heavy infantry to battle in the forest is not a good idea. Amandina tilted her head and looked at the Judlan mercenaries at the edge of the forest. But as soon as she said that, she was immediately met with a rebuttal. My lady, my lord, you can't say that. We have to eat in this world. Mr. Makarov is kind enough to take us in, and we have to be loyal to him. Look, I've never heard of a mercenary leaving his comrades in danger and running away alone. A sudden voice came from the forest. A bearded Judlan mercenary walked out from the back of the forest with a black weapon on his shoulder. He had a smile on his face as he shook his head and sighed with a heavy Abyssal Sea accent. Brando, Amandina, and the Roman turned around to look at the man. The young man narrowed his eyes. A person who could move freely in the forest would definitely have a high status in the mercenary group. Frank, assault captain. The Judlan mercenary rubbed his nose and introduced himself. What's that? Brando's gaze fell on the weapon in his hand. Flintlock gun, this is my treasure. Frank patted the pitch-black thing and laughed mischievously. Brando knew about this weapon. It used discarded magic crystals as a primer, and active elemental probes to ignite the gunpowder. It was a weapon that belonged to this world. The Afrin people began to equip themselves with flintlock muskets as early as 30 years ago, and also established 2 flintlock regiments. The dwarves were even earlier, and their use of matchlock muskets could be traced back to the Silver Year. Firearms were extremely powerful in close range. The best quality flintlock gun could deal damage within 50 steps, and it was almost as powerful as a brass-ranked weapon of the same grade. The tactic of using firearms was very mature in this era, but it did not have a decisive advantage when compared to the enchanted projectile troops. However, he knew that there were many mercenaries who liked to use firearms, especially handguns. There were only a few who used rifles. After all, there were no bayonets in this era. Brando glanced at the mercenary. In this world of magic, firearms did not change the way of warfare as much as in his previous world. Gunpowder weapons were not common, so he did not have the time to study how bayonets worked. Amandina's face was a little hot. Vulgar mercenary. She thought, but her face was still vigilant. What did you mean by that? What I meant was that the fighting style you mentioned is a concern that only a regular army would have. We are mercenaries who are struggling, so we naturally have our own way of doing things. No matter if we are heavy infantry or light swordsmen, no matter what the situation is, everyone has to fight side by side. What you said is not wrong, but you still have to consider reality. Frank replied respectfully. Even though he was respectful on the surface, it was not difficult to hear the disdain in his words. Amandina choked for a moment. She knew that her knowledge was shallow because it was obtained from books, but she was still a little angry that her knowledge was taken for granted. She looked at Brando for a moment, then turned back. Her bright eyes were still vigilant, but she changed her tone and asked softly, "Do you believe what they said, Mr. Brando?" Brando looked at Frank and nodded. But what?" he asked back. "Do you really believe?" Amandina looked at him and asked with her eyes. Brando smiled and greeted Frank and Sanford, then urged his horse to speed up. He did not answer and only left the back view of the noble's daughter. But Amandina was a person who did not want to admit defeat. She also urged her horse to chase after him. She coughed and asked, "My lord, I feel that they are not normal." "What?" "Intuition." "Little Roman, what do you think?" Brando asked without turning his head. "I don't know," Roman shook his head, "but my aunt said that if the explanation is too general or too detailed, it is a sign of guilt." Brando smiled and turned back to scratch her nose. "You know, but you still want to beat around the bush. What a sly little fox." I really don't know." Roman raised his eyebrows and hurriedly explained. Amandina didn't know what to do next to the flirting couple, but she finally understood what was going on. It was not that Brando did not know, but that he knew too well. It seemed that he had long suspected their motives. Saying that the heavy infantrymen were slow, so they were placed at the back of the line sounded like an excuse. She sighed in relief when she thought of this. "If that's the case," Amandina looked at Roman and Brando and asked with a red face, "what should we do?" "Just act according to the situation," Brando replied. He had already remembered the plot mentioned in the guide, but he thought that as long as these people were not targeting him, everything would be fine. But this matter was a little troublesome and he could not help but have a headache. He originally wanted to reduce the trouble. But he did not think that he would be dragged into a new problem. If he had to blame someone, he could only blame Buga and Makarov for provoking such a troublesome opponent. Instead of saying that it was a competition between two mercenary groups, it was more accurate to say that the mastermind behind the Paper Cards mercenary group had his eyes on the Grey Wolves mercenaries. He could not help but look at the people around him. He was not worried about their fates, but he was thinking about how to get out of this trouble. But then again, it was a little strange that a small mercenary group would attract the attention of these people. Hey, tree herders! Compared to the tree herders, the members of All for One were like law-abiding citizens. But what was the purpose of the tree herders after the Grey Wolves mercenaries? Although he did not want to cause trouble, Brando subconsciously used the player's way of thinking to think about this matter. The guide gave the mission flow, but the details were very vague. Not to mention the background, which was not mentioned at all in the guide. He knocked on his head and thought of a way to get out of this situation before the Grey Wolves mercenaries and the tree herders fight. The boss of this quest was the Oracle Ekman. The root of the word Ekman came from the word Im in the rune language. It was a symbol of the vast mountains and the boundless ocean. In ancient times there was also a giant beast called Ekman, but whether it existed in Kurlut's mythology or in the legends of the mountain people, it symbolized walking between the mountains and forests. It was a huge, living, active mountain ridge. The giant beast Ekman was the descendant of the mountain giant Garl. Legend said that as long as it was connected to the earth, it would have endless life. The Oracle Ekman, to Brando, was more like the name of a monster with a symbolic meaning. According to the legends, the oracles were monsters that the tree shepherds used the blood of God to cultivate in the bodies of animals and humans. Although they had such a sacred name, they were the same as the golden demonic tree, a product that distorted nature and blasphemed against God. Brando couldn't help but recall his experience with the Oracle of Heaven, Amar, and the Oracle of Darkness, Black Lotus. The former was about level 50 in its incomplete form, and he fought it with his teammates in an underground dungeon in the Freeport of Ampere Seal. After a tough battle they finally won. The latter was the true Oracle of Heaven, a level 67 elite leader, and the final boss of the perfect heroic main story quest in Deldra. They had to form two groups to defeat it. The Oracle of Heaven was so terrifying, and even though it was only level 50, it had the strength of a gold-ranked player. Brando didn't even have the slightest intention of fighting it. But he still wanted to take advantage of it. He looked at Buga and Makarov in front of him. In history, the Grey Wolves mercenaries should have been annihilated in this battle, but Makarov and Buga didn't die, which meant that there was a problem. As for what the problem was, it was up to him to decide. In any case, Brando's mind started to work. One must know that the Oracle of Heaven's loot list had the Heaven's Spear, Fana. It was one of the highest level fantasy weapons around level 50, and it was famous for its ability to ignore all physical defense. In the Dark Oracle's drop list, there was also the Dark Side of the Moon, that countless Nephilic Judge players went crazy over. The Dark Side of the Moon was a mythical weapon. Legend had it that this scythe was once used by the god of death, Descartes. Decapitation. 1% chance of ignoring all defense and dealing 50% of the current HP of non-boss units. Annihilation. 10% chance of dealing damage to a weapon with this attribute to suppress all healing effects. In conclusion, even though the Oracle of Heaven was powerful, it also had another name, Treasure Vault. The tree herders were really rich, and only Lady Martha knew how they got so many rare equipment. Of course, this was not the most ridiculous thing. The blood of the gods of heaven came from the god of the clouds, Jammas. The blood of the gods of darkness came from the goddess of the abyss, Elaine. The blood of the gods of earth came from the lord of the mountains, the giant Garwitch. Martha above, how did they get the blood of the gods that have long since disappeared? Brando shook his head and muttered to himself. After the age of darkness, the gods in the sky had long since passed away and became stars. This was the era of mortals. Other than the one and only god of gods, Martha, this world was no longer ruled by powerful willpower. Those who were called gods today were either fake gods, or the many stars in the sky that were called laws. What are you thinking about, my lord? Amandina saw that he was absent-minded. Brando shook his head and blurted out, the power of the mountains and rivers. The power of the mountains and rivers? Author's note. Yesterday the internet was cut off when I came back from dinner, and it's still not fixed yet. But even if the heavens want to destroy me, I will not give up. I will do my best to protect myself. There's also a 4,000-word chapter below. At the end I will continue to ask for votes. Looking at the votes now is really sad equals. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 144. The power of the mountains was a pair of gauntlets. In fact, the gauntlet was a special weapon in the Amber Sword. Although it was used by warriors, mercenaries, monks and monk soldiers, compared to the latter two, it was less common among warriors and mercenaries. However, this did not stop Brando from being interested in the power of the mountains. When it came to the Oracle Ekman, the first thing that came to the mind of the players would be the power of the mountains, which was the most valuable item on the list, or the Thunder Slayer, which was a complete drop. Of course, Brando would not dream about the Thunder Slayer. As a level 67 Oracle, it should have the corresponding elemental power. Destroying a group of people like them would only be a matter of moving its fingers. Although the future Grand Sword hero Buga had also activated his elemental power, there was a natural difference between humans and sacred blood creatures. Unless the body was perfected in the later stage and obtained the golden bloodline, the difference between humans and sacred blood creatures was several levels. Otherwise, humans would be at a disadvantage as a lower race. However, not to mention the level 62 Thunder Slayer, even the power of the mountains was enough to tempt people. As a level 45 fantasy weapon, Brando did not know how powerful the gauntlets were. In fact, he had only seen it once in a video. However, he knew one thing for sure. In terms of damage amplification, a level 45 fantasy weapon was 17 to 18 times more powerful than the Thorn of Light, or even more. Just this point alone was enough to make any player go crazy. In the past, Brendel had seen players who got mythical or fantasy weapons that were not suitable for their class and had to retrain their accounts. After all, players could choose their own class, but not everyone could get their hands on a weapon that was fantasy grade or above. This was a matter of luck. Of course, he could not do that now, but he was more than willing to redesign his leveling plan for a god weapon. After all, it was something that would bring him huge profits. Take the Lionheart Sword for example. The kings of Oween had been searching for it for almost 7 centuries, but there was still no news of it. The Lionheart Sword was merely a fantasy weapon, a level 70 fantasy longsword. Even though he had a clue about the Lionheart's whereabouts, Brendel knew that having a clue and completing a quest were two completely different things. It was too vague and unrealistic. If he could get the power of the mountains first, then his class design would definitely be based on the first fantasy weapon. He then patted his head to remind himself that both the Lionheart Sword and the power of the mountains were just a fantasy. The Grey Wolves mercenary group had not encountered the tree herders yet, and their representative, the Paper Cards mercenary group, were nowhere to be seen. In fact, it was just his wishful thinking that Buga and Makarov could kill the Oracle. All in all, safety was the first priority. Then, he would see if he could find an opportunity to make some money. That was the safest way. Once Brando entered the zone, he would naturally follow the rules of the game. At this moment, Madara, the lizard men, the Oracle, and the tree herders were not even worth mentioning. The Oracle was a terrifying opponent, but that was all there was to it. Brando himself had faced 3 out of the 12 tree herders and defeated 2 of them. Even though he was no longer level 130, his experience and knowledge were still at that height. The Oracle was not without flaws. The power of the mountains? Amandina's black gem-like eyes flashed with a trace of doubt. She asked in confusion, "What is the power of the mountains?" "I just thought of a famous treasure in this area. Legend has it that it is in the ruins of the Silver Elves, but no one has ever seen it." Brando had to find a suitable excuse for his slip of the tongue. He could not say that the power of the mountains was actually a fantasy weapon with a golden label, and that there would be an oracle called Ekman, who would bring it over. He did not want to leave an impression that he was mentally unstable in Amandina's mind. But even so, his words still aroused the dissatisfaction of this noble lady. Amandina looked at him with a hint of resentment and sighed, "My lord, now is not the time to think about this, right?" "Of course." Brando could only nod with a bitter smile. "I was just distracted for a moment." But he could only fool himself. Amandina was smart and sharp, and she looked at him suspiciously. In her impression, the young knight was a shrewd and cautious young knight who would not be distracted by unimportant matters. It was as though he was constantly plotting something. Even though everything he did seemed to be unrelated on the surface, but in the end, it was proven that everything was arranged in advance. Amandina was doubtful of how a person could achieve such a feat. The plan was still a plan, but Brendel seemed to know that some things would eventually happen, and he waited calmly for the right moment to happen. This kind of person was either extremely confident or had foresight. He was able to see the future, and could see the direction of the development of a matter. Of course, she did not even think that a person could predict the future. Even the astrologers who belonged to the royal family could only predict the direction of major events through the strings and cards controlled by the twins of fate. No one could predict the future, no matter how big or small. In her opinion, the only ones who could do this were the gods, but even the gods had passed away in this era. She obviously did not think that Brendel was not from this world. A moment of distraction? Amandina frowned slightly, and she showed a slight dissatisfaction. "My lord, if there are some things that you are not willing to tell me, I will not ask." Brando felt that he was more wrong than Do-E. Even though he had some secrets that he could not tell outsiders, he had no choice. Martha above, how could he tell outsiders these things? Even if he did, no one would believe him, and he would only leave behind the name of a lunatic. He wasn't going to do such a bad deal. He could only patiently explain, "It's not like that, Miss Amandina." But before he could finish, the Roman lady came back from who knows where and promised him with an excited expression, "If it's Brando's secret, I won't ask." The Roman promises. Brando glared at her fiercely. If there was a person in this world who was the best at showing off a desire to see the world in chaos, it would be this merchant lady. But in the end, he sighed and waved his hand, "Forget it, let's talk about business. Set up your tents a little closer to me at night. Don't take off your outer leather armor and don't sleep too deeply, understand?" Amandina immediately looked around cautiously. "What's wrong?" "We'll talk about it when the time comes." He turned his head and saw the merchant lady nodding her head, but her expression clearly said, "I don't care at all." Brendel's eyes immediately narrowed. He knew her temperament very well, especially you, my dear Miss Romaine. You better stay awake. Don't think I don't know that you're like a little pig when you're asleep. If Mother Marcia doesn't come personally, no one would be able to wake you up. But my aunt said that women will age quickly if they don't sleep early. You didn't even die when you didn't sleep for a few days in Bucci. But if I slept at that time, Madara would catch up to me. It's the same now. Brando replied in an annoyed tone. His hands were stained with the smell of spices. From the pungent aroma, Iko could distinguish the large and small fennel from the Silver Sand Coast and the cinnamon from Grimoires. He had practiced his sense of smell in the toxicology class, and distinguishing spices was just one of the skills he had learned. But the rich fragrance in the air still stimulated his nostrils and made him want to sneeze. Eek wished that his heart had stopped beating, but it did not go as he wished. His heart was still thumping in his chest. He shut his mouth tightly, trying not to make a sound. Even if he desperately wanted to gasp for breath, his chest hurt, and his head was attacked by waves of dizziness, he could only endure and let the sweat on his forehead drip down. He looked down and saw the sweat dripping down and forming a dark spot on the white sack. "Who are you people? What are you doing here?" Eek could not see the person who spoke, but he could tell who it was from the familiar voice. It was the leader of the second squadron, Capo, and his comrades. "Don't come over," he thought. "Don't speak. Everyone turn around and leave. Those bastards, don't let them get suspicious." He stared at the shadows on the opposite wall, afraid that he would miss the slightest detail. Occasionally he would close his eyes and pray to Mother Marcia, praying that Capo and the others would leave immediately. But he knew that was impossible. Unless a miracle happened. That was why he prayed for a miracle. He always knew that his adoptive father, Makarov, left some men in town to keep an eye on him. Rather than keeping an eye on him, it was more like taking care of him. Apart from Buga and his adoptive father, Capo was the one who took care of him the most in the mercenary group. He was also his first swordsmanship teacher. He also knew that the man known as Maned Wolf, Makarov, knew that he was hiding in town all this time. Even when he sneaked back to the inn, they should know about it as well. It was just a tacit understanding between them. They still treated him like a child, as if he was always someone who needed to be taken care of. But it was different this time. Those guys are definitely not from the Paper Cards mercenary group. What's the big deal about the Paper Cards mercenary group? Do you think Yak will be afraid of an old rival who has been opposing me all year round? Why didn't his adoptive father think of this? He couldn't help but rub his forehead, but halfway through he put down his hand. "We can't let those bastards find out." But Capo and his men are still outside. They are not their match. Those bastards are demons who kill without batting an eyelid. Eek struggled. There were a few times when he wanted to jump out to warn Capo and shout for them to leave. Even though he knew that his actions would be of no use, the young man's feelings for Capo as both a teacher and a friend urged him to fulfill his duty. It was his duty, but he knew that he had a more important responsibility. He could not let those bastards succeed. "Where is the young man you were chasing?" Capo spoke again. Eek's heart skipped a beat. "Hurry up and hand Eek over, we all saw it." This was another younger voice, sounding even more impatient. "Chris, you impulsive bastard." Eek cursed in his heart. He couldn't help but tighten his grip on his sword. His whole body couldn't help but tremble. Then he heard that familiar laughter. It was bone-chilling, like ice needles piercing his back. So you are really with him? P.S. I suddenly remembered that I don't have a full attendance, but it's still awesome. Everyone please support us. By the way, please slow down for those who are DTs. Don't release it after only 15 minutes. It's already a flop to begin with. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 145. There's an acquaintance here, Carl. A man in a black knight's training uniform looked at the bonfire in the dark forest under the undulating mountain range from afar. The Grey Wolves mercenaries seemed to be sleeping in a large cradle. It was quiet in the direction of the camp. Only the wind from the sea from the west infiltrated the night, causing the forest to respond with rustling sounds. It sounded like the waves. It also sounded like some kind of monster was screaming in the forest far away. A tall monster was dragging the bloody corpse of a female sentinel out of the forest with its huge bony claws. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize it. He had seen this huntress in the afternoon. However, she was now a lifeless corpse. The monster's empty chest made cracking sounds, and the orange flames in its eyes flickered. It was dissatisfied with the Black Knight's casual attitude. "It's not your turn to teach me a lesson, little guy." The monster's voice was dry and squeaky. It reminded people of clockwork that had not been maintained for a long time. It straightened its body and threw the corpse down. The dead mercenary fell into a bush like a rag doll, and the crackling sound of twigs snapping could be heard 34 feet away. However, this place was too far away from the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp. It was difficult for such a small sound to travel that far, especially in the windy night. The knight in black frowned as he glanced at his companion. He saw a group of ghost-like translucent spiders that were green in color and emitted a faint glow. They screeched as they jumped down from the treetops. Thud. A soft sound was heard. Brando was startled. He looked at the card that had fallen out of his pocket and was lying flat on the ground. The card had turned gray. It was a wind spirit spider. It had already entered the graveyard. However, the first thing he felt was not heartache. Instead, he picked up the card and was stunned. He immediately raised his head and extinguished the oil lamp. The surroundings became dark. The farthest light outside the tent was 100 feet away. So fast. He was caught off guard. In the evening, the Grey Wolves mercenaries chose to set up camp in the Windy Valley. Brando suggested to Makarov the maned wolf that the two sides should keep a distance from each other to avoid suspicion. Although Buga and Makarov were a little surprised, they still agreed. Brando didn't trust them, and they didn't trust the young man's subordinates either. Thus, the two sides, each with their own ulterior motives, reached a consensus. However, Makarov didn't expect that Brando would use this as an excuse to escape. The young man crawled out of the tent, and his skin shivered a little from the cold air. Even though Chablis mountain area was extremely hot during the day, the temperature in the valley dropped drastically at night. If a traveler didn't prepare a tent or a sleeping bag, he would still be cold. He looked left and right, and a few figures could not escape his senses. Even though Brando did not go through professional training, his 3.7-ounce perception was equivalent to a person with a natural gift. He could hear the sound of a needle falling to the ground 100 meters away in the silent night. It seems like Makarov only suspects us and doesn't have any ill intentions towards us. After confirming that there was no one nearby, he carefully crawled out of the tent. At this moment, the young man was fully armed. He wore nail armor and carried all the necessary weapons and tools. He dragged a backpack with one hand, which contained the necessary water and food. He then approached a tent not far away and patted the cloth. After a few seconds, a curious voice came from within. "Brando? Roman, why are you here?" Brando was speechless. He confirmed that it was indeed Amandina's tent. "It's a surprise." Amandina laughed softly in the tent. She was a little pleased with herself. "Surprise my ass." Brando turned around in annoyance. He saw Amandina coming out of the Roman's tent with her hair tied up. She had an apologetic look on her face, but Brando knew that if the Roman had any ideas, she would not care about what others thought. He sighed and apologized to the noble lady. "I'll have to trouble you." Amandina was surprised. A faint smile appeared on her face. She looked at the tent behind Brando and said, "I can see that my lord really likes the Roman lady." She mouthed the words. Brando nodded. He allowed Amandina to do as she pleased. It was not only because he felt a sense of familiarity towards such a carefree girl, but it was also because of Brando's soul. On the other hand, the Roman lady was the first person he met in this world. He had a special feeling towards her. Moreover, this merchant lady was smart and carefree. Very few people would dislike her. Even though Brendel was only 19 years old in this life, the two souls in his body determined that he was no longer the shy youth he once was. He understood what he should pursue and what kind of responsibilities he had to bear. He opened a corner of the tent and saw Amandina looking at him with a charming smile. "Are you ready?" he asked. Both Roman and Amandina nodded in agreement. Brando raised his head. As if in response to his movement, more than 10 figures came out of the surrounding tents. They didn't need to talk to each other as they began to quietly put away their tents. Although these mercenaries were fully armed, with all kinds of metal weapons hanging from their belts, they didn't make a single sound when they moved. It was Amandina's first time seeing Brando summoned from the cards, but her bright eyes quickly flashed with a trace of surprise. What a group of well-trained mercenaries. Where did he find these people? The mercenaries of Lopez were able to leave their illustrious name in the long river of history. Naturally, they were not just for show. The creatures summoned by the card of fate represented a collective concept. In other words, the 12 mercenaries were a group of heroic spirits that best reflected the strengths of the mercenaries of Lopez. Loyalty, honor, high morale, strict discipline, and they did not fear death and pain like real creatures. They were probably the best soldiers that had ever appeared in this world. Unfortunately, Brando felt that the number was still too little. Even so, it was enough to make Amandina speechless. She quickly touched her cheeks and looked at Brando. She suspected that she was dreaming. It was not that she had never encountered mercenaries before. Nobles would more or less interact with these people because of their own businesses. Of course, other than the ruffians and scum, most mercenaries were more or less related to the military. But that was it. The best mercenaries she had seen were none other than the Grey Wolves mercenaries. The maned wolf, Makarov's mercenaries were definitely not ordinary mercenaries, but compared to the 12 mercenaries in Brendel's hands, it was like the difference between clouds and mud. The inherent laziness of mercenaries could not be seen in these people. They seemed to have something that was rarely seen in mercenaries. Amandina furrowed her eyebrows. She could not determine what it was at that moment. But after a flash of inspiration she remembered the difference. It was pride and honor. She took a deep breath. Very few mercenaries who relied on fighting for a living would maintain a sacred sense of honor for their profession. It was more similar to a knight's sense of honor. She could not help but look at Brando again. In her heart, she was certain that these people were not mercenaries, but retainers that this young man brought out from his family. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. A young noble leaving his family to carve out his own world. This was like the plot of a legend. When she first heard Brando say this, she felt a little yearning. After all, everyone had the spirit of romance and adventure in their hearts. Even Amandina, who had received the most orthodox education since she was a child, was no exception. Assisting a young knight who started from scratch to conquer the world was an irresistible temptation for a girl of her age who had received such a degree of education. But from the looks of it, this lord did not start from scratch. Amandina was pleasantly surprised, as if she had discovered a small secret. Of course, she did not feel depressed because of this. On the contrary, she felt relieved. She convinced herself that at least this meant that Brando was prepared. He was not a hot-blooded young knight who acted blindly and only wanted to imitate the ancients. However, Brando did not expect that his subordinate would have so many thoughts after seeing his card soldiers. Of course, if he knew what Amandina was thinking, he would definitely think of a way to do it a few more times. This way he would be able to easily gather a large number of loyal retainers. But he did not have the mood to care about these things. He quickly realized that he had encountered a small problem. The 12 mercenaries of Lopez quickly tidied up the camp. But when they gathered together and prepared to wait for the next order, Brando suddenly noticed 2 figures walking over from the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp. He immediately frowned. He had clearly seen one of the 2 figures walking over. It was a white-haired youth called Rady. Brando immediately thought that the other party might have noticed the commotion here, but he quickly suppressed this suspicion because the 2 people were clearly not walking towards them. He calculated the path that the other party would take. It should be between their camp and the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp. He was slightly startled. These 2 fellows wanted to go outside the camp? Traitor? Brando immediately thought of a possibility. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 146. Rady and the person beside him were getting closer and closer, and the 2 slender figures were like ghosts in the forest. Everyone stopped and looked in that direction at the same time. Amandina lowered her head to estimate, and her expression changed. She immediately looked at Brando, her black gem-like eyes filled with anxiety. Their camp was in the middle of the forest, and the mercenaries of Lopez had already put away their tents. Even if the other party was just passing by, they would definitely notice something was amiss. Don't be impatient. Brendel stared in that direction and replied. Even though most of the people present did not understand what he meant by, "Don't be impatient," they subconsciously quietened down. Brendel raised his hand, and the calm expression on his face calmed everyone down. It was a clear hint to the others that they should not act rashly. Amandina opened her mouth slightly. The mercenaries of Lopez were Brando's summoned creatures, and their first duty was to carry out the orders of a planeswalker. Even if there was a cliff in front of them, they would not hesitate to move forward, let alone such a small request. But in the eyes of the noble woman, these veterans who looked like they had been through hundreds of battles and should have been proud of themselves, just because of a small action from Brendel. The degree to which they obeyed his orders to the extent that it was shocking. No one spoke. She subconsciously held her breath, not even daring to breathe loudly. The wind in the valley whistled above their heads. The wind came from the mountain pass in the south, and it was like an invisible hand passing through the branches, causing the leaves on the top layer of the canopy to rustle. The dancing branches caused the dim starlight to flicker, and the intertwining light fell on Rady's face, causing the white-haired youth to have a gloomy expression. The 2 of them were not as careful as Brando expected, and it could be said that they did not care about the crackling sound of the branches breaking. Brando suddenly remembered that Makarov did not tell too many people that their camp was in this direction. This meant that Rady did not know that the 2 of them were approaching Brando's group. Even the maned wolf doesn't want to cause trouble? Brando thought. There were less than 100 feet left. Brando believed that as long as that guy walked to the edge of the forest, he would definitely notice the abnormality here. As long as he insisted that it was because he didn't trust them, they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. Even though the 2 of them looked suspicious, Makarov would rather trust his own party members. He was equally nervous, but he didn't show it on his face. The young man looked to the side and saw that the mercenary named Nightsong was also looking at him questioningly. He was the leader of this group of mercenaries, and it was as if he was the leader of this group of mercenaries. He was experienced and wise. The old mercenary's intention was clear. Should we take the initiative and kill him? But get rid of him? Easier said than done. This was a very common choice for mercenaries. Brando struggled. Although this was not the first time he had killed someone, it was different this time. If it's Pine Fortress, there's no room for survival. I'm not so pedantic that I can ignore the threat to my life. But in the end, he still had a soul that came from a civilized society, and to kill without hesitation just because of a suspicion was instinctive. But how could he not understand that for someone in his position, being indecisive was a taboo? He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Should he follow the will of this world and completely cut off his ties with the past? Or should he stick to his bottom line? He was Brando, but he also had Sophie's mark in his soul. If he denied this point, it would be the same as denying everything in the past. Perhaps that reality was nothing more than an illusion. Otherwise, why would he be in this world right now? Or was it a butterfly dreaming of Jianghu? Who could say for sure? However, the memories that belonged to that world were so deep. The joys and sorrows of the past at a certain point in time seemed to be engraved in the memories of yesterday. How could he deny it? If he cut off the memories of the past, then what was the point of all his hard work? If he lost his soul, would he still be called a person? Even if he was afraid that he would not be the same person. For a moment, a mess of thoughts filled his mind, but it was also like a sharp sword that cut through all the knots in an instant. He opened his eyes like the king of the Macedonians. His eyes were clear, and he had found his answer. My lord. Amandina saw through Brando's hesitation, and she could not help but be slightly startled. She originally thought that this kind of decision was natural for a young noble like Brando, and there was no need to consider it all. This was the rule of the game between nobles. When Brando heard the girl's question, he turned around and looked at her. She could not help but be stunned again. She did not think that Brando would show such a look, self-deprecating, relaxed, and a trace of regret. She did not know where this young knight's compassionate look came from, and when did Erwin, a cold-blooded noble, become like this? Perhaps it was the tears of a crocodile, but it did not seem to be necessary. Or could it be that the Highland Knight of Karsuk still followed the ancient teachings to this day? When Brando raised his hand, it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but when he put it down, it was incomparably easy. Get ready. But if possible, try to only stun him. I don't want to completely fall out with the maned wolf. He ordered in a barely audible voice. He did not know if he would be seen as an idiot for doing so, but if he did not do so, then he would definitely be an idiot. The mercenaries of Lopez nodded in unison. As creatures that were summoned, they had no right to judge or question their lord's decision. But there was a trace of regret in the Nightsong tiger's eyes. If he wanted to settle this once and for all, he had to be more decisive. On the other hand, Amandina let out a sigh of relief. The girl's eyelashes fluttered, and she could not help but look at Brando with a new gaze. For the first time, she realized that the young lord that she followed seemed to have some special traits that she did not know about. She did not know if this trait was good or bad, but it did not seem to fit in with this ancient world. She did not know why, but she did not feel a trace of unnaturalness. On the contrary, this was the first time in a long time that she felt at ease. 70 feet. Brando. At this time, the Roman nervously called out from the side. Brando was stunned, but he still whispered, "Don't make a sound." Romain thought for a moment and nodded. The mercenaries of Lopez were already in position, waiting for Reedy and the other person to reach the edge of the clearing before swarming forward. 12 experienced soldiers with the strength of an iron-ranked warrior. They were confident that they could stop the two of them before they could react. But Brando was still a little nervous. There might be strong enemies outside the forest and he could not waste any time here. But what surprised him was that when Rady and the other person were about to walk out of the bushes, they slowly stopped. What did they discover? Brando's eyelids twitched, and he almost immediately ordered his mercenaries to charge forward, but he forcefully stopped himself from doing so. Attacking from this distance would mess up the entire plan. The distance was too far and there was a small patch of bushes in between. He slowly calmed down. It seems that the white-haired boy did not discover the situation here. He turned around to take a look. The mercenaries of Lopez were as calm as ever. Other than the heartless Miss Romaine who was still looking around, Amandina was so scared that her face was pale white. It was as if her heart was about to stop pumping blood into her body. He turned back again and was surprised to see that Rady had not only stopped, but also turned back to talk to his companion. They were at least 20 meters away from the edge of the forest, and the clearing was at least 50 meters away. Even with Brando's perception, he could only pick up one or two keywords. The white-haired young man's voice was not loud, and he would occasionally look at the camp's direction as if he was concerned about something. But soon, the conversation between the two of them became heated. In the end, it turned into an argument. Even though most of the people here could not hear what they were saying, they could tell from their hands that neither side was able to convince the other. Brando could not help but feel gloomy when he realized that the two of them were not here for him. It's the middle of the night, are the two of you here to argue? Can't you go somewhere else then? It was a pity that Rady could not hear Brando's thoughts. On the contrary, their voices became louder and louder. Brando could barely make out the words eek, Chablis, and necklace. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. That young man called Eek is still in Chablis? It seems like Rady knows about it, and there's no reason for Macaros to not know about it. But this mercenary group is really full of problems. But he still did not understand why the white-haired young man would come out in the middle of the night to discuss something that had nothing to do with the current storyline. He could not help but raise his head and look through the gaps between the leaves. The blood star was already in the middle of the sky. This star is the most punctual way for Erwin to time the summer nights. It's almost midnight. P.S. I didn't send the message last night because I was disconnected again. It's normal for me to be disconnected these days. If you want to scold someone, scold Chengdu Telecom. Also, I don't need a thief to judge whether or not I have integrity. *CK, you want me to prepare things for you when you steal? Do I owe you anything? Chapter 147. It's almost midnight. Brendel could not help but think of the strategy guide. It said that the enemies would make their first move at midnight after the Lizardmen bandits were eliminated. The enemies in the guide were obviously the Tree Shepherds, or the mercenary group paper cards that was standing in front of the stage. The sudden attack was very fierce, and it could be said that all of us were struck senseless. The attack started from the north, but anyone who tried to escape to the south would die at least once. That's because the main force of the tree herders was in the south. Well, at least this means that the advanced AI that Torrential Rain promised wasn't just a gimmick on paper. Our response was to try our best to save the Grey Wolves mercenary group from the fate of destruction. It's worth noting that the maned wolf Makarov and the vice leader, Buga, are extremely strong. They're about 45V and 55V players. Ensuring their survival is the most important factor in helping you complete the quest. However, we did discuss another possible solution. It came from a small discovery in the east. I think Torrential Rain must have considered the players' endurance at this stage, so they designed a radiant altar in the east of this area. Our group discussed how to transport it, but it doesn't matter what method we use. There's no doubt that as long as you can save the Grey Wolves mercenary group from the fate of destruction. This might be the most important condition for the quest to reach a 100% completion rate. Brando rubbed his nose. Rather than calling it a guide, it was more like a lesson summary. Due to the unique nature of the quest, he couldn't complete it repeatedly. He used to view the whole story as if he was reading a novel. After all, it was exciting to watch a group of players go on an adventure. Brando especially liked using his imagination to fill in the gaps between the lines. It was as if he was there in the real world. Damn it. If you're writing a battle report, you should at least make the time, place and characters clear. Brando couldn't help but curse the person who wrote the guide had a bad habit. Is there really no problem with words like, "one day at midnight," appearing in a serious lesson summary post? In the past he didn't think so, but now he realized that this kind of perfunctory attitude was very harmful. Of course, at this time he couldn't drag that guy out from the other side of the internet to listen to him talk about real men big boobs. Now he could only rely on his own experience to make up for the lack of a strategy. The only thing left for him to do was to look up at the sky. Of course, there was also the hope that Reedy could finish his sentence a little faster. Of course, he wasn't aiming for a 100% completion rate. In the past, if he completed a mission perfectly in the game, there would be a so-called double reward. But in this real world, where was he supposed to find the damned system to receive the reward? Mo Face silently prayed to the sky, "Lord Martha, please throw a pie down." This was obviously unrealistic. Brando's plan was very clear. Previously, he did not understand the direction of the entire plot. Now that he remembered it clearly, he naturally had to revise his plan. Now he had to leave the Grey Wolves mercenaries before the tree herders attacked, and then rush to the Altar of Light to open another branch. Then he would directly use this branch to flatten the Lizardmen bandits, get the Sage Slate and leave. As for whether the Grey Wolves mercenaries lived or died, it didn't matter much to him. Every year in Wond, there were hundreds of mercenary groups that were destroyed due to various conflicts. Moreover, he didn't think that he had the ability to subdue Maned Wolf, Makarov or Buga. Makarov was a level 45 great swordsman, and Buga was a level 56 knight of the church who had activated his elemental energy. Of course, Buga himself might not admit this. But no matter what, Brando didn't dare to think about these two big names for the time being. What he was relying on now was to find more potential stocks like Amandina and Tamar. Since he could see the future, then investing in the long term was obviously the best way to do things with low risk and high returns. But even though his imagination was beautiful, reality was not what he wanted. Not to mention that there were no flaws in his plan, Brando definitely did not consider such an unexpected situation. While he was thinking about it, the Roman girl behind him couldn't hold it in anymore. Brando. She raised her beautiful eyebrows and used her finger to poke Brando's back. She once again used a voice that she thought was very soft. Of course, the merchant girl thought that her voice was very soft, but with her temperament, it was mostly wishful thinking. Everyone present was scared out of their wits by this sudden voice. In fact, the Roman's voice wasn't very loud. At most, it was similar to her normal voice, and at most it was a little hurried. But in this silent night, in this silent forest, it was still a little out of place. Bull, bull. Brando covered the girl's mouth with his hand and looked back. As expected, he saw Rady stopped and looked around vigilantly. At this moment, Brando felt like strangling the Roman girl to death. But of course he wouldn't do that because he couldn't bear to do it. Fortunately, Rady only seemed to be nervous for a moment, and then turned back to talk to her companions. Brando sighed in relief. Then he thought of something and turned back to glare fiercely at Roman. But the merchant girl was still shaking her head unhurriedly and kept making woo sounds. It seemed that she was quite dissatisfied with Brando's actions. Brando almost lost his temper at first, but he immediately felt that something was wrong. Although Romain was a little undisciplined and had the guts to act lawlessly on the surface, he knew that this girl who often smiled like a little fox was actually very shrewd on the inside. Otherwise, how could she not be at a disadvantage? Just as he thought of this, the Nightsong Tiger stretched out a rough hand and pressed on his hand. He was slightly startled. This was even more unusual. As his summoned creatures, the mercenaries of Lopez rarely acted on their own initiative. He raised his head and saw the experienced mercenary's eyes filled with vigilance. Brando let go of his hand and the Roman also stopped. Not only them, even Rady stopped again. The white-haired young man couldn't help but turn around and look at them. The forest seemed to have quieted down for a moment. Not only the people but even the wind stopped. "What did you hear?" Brando asked subconsciously. He knew that the Roman's senses were far better than normal people. The merchant girl glared at him fiercely, then nodded. Brando's nose twitched and his heart skipped a beat. There was a strange smell in the air. It was a little pungent, but it was more like a spicy stench. It seemed to be the smell of boiling water from underground volcanoes. The smell of sulfur. Brando's mind flashed with this thought, and he had already unsheathed his sword. He didn't even think about it as it was an instinctive reaction. Those damned disciples of the Black Flames. That bastard who wrote the guide tricked me again. If he had said earlier that there were disciples of the Black Flames, I wouldn't have gotten involved in this mess. He cursed in his mind in an instant. The disciples of the Black Flames belonged to the forces of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders, Gu Worm Lord Myad. However, they were different from the Gu magicians who played with insects. These dregs of the human race were the bastards that dealt with those fellows in the fiery sulfur river. They were collectively known as the people below. Simply put, they were the demon lords of the Georgandy Ridge. Brando couldn't help but slap his head in frustration. He should have thought of this earlier. The forest near Erewin's southern border had always been the territory of the disciples of the Black Flames. However, his attention was focused on the Sage Slate and the strange Grey Wolves mercenaries. For a moment he had forgotten about this common sense. Was this the legendary darkness under the lamp? However, the reason why Brando was so wary of these people was not because they were strong. It was because these bastards were crazy. They were even crazier than the fanatics of the Holy Church. When the battle started, they were probably just short of shouting that they were invulnerable. Moreover, the disciples of the Black Flames had chained up different demons. Although they were fighting together, they each had their own ulterior motives. This should have seriously affected their battle strength, but the creatures under the Jianghu ridge had all kinds of strange abilities that were hard to guard against. Moreover, the high-level disciples could absorb the power of the demons and fuse with the demons they had chained up. Brando wanted to vomit just thinking about that disgusting scene. One or two of these monsters would be fine, but if there were too many of them, even a god would not be able to handle it. Brendel's first instinct was to run away. However, just as this thought flashed through his mind, there was a gust of wind in the darkness. As a reincarnated warrior at level 130, Brando was all too familiar with this sound. He subconsciously shrunk his neck and sure enough, he saw a black chain with two spiked balls flying out from the darkness of the forest. Spiked ball. There's a lord of spiked chains. Brendel watched as the spiked ball tore down a thick tree trunk and flew past Rady and the youth beside him. Even though it did not cause any damage, it clearly scared the two youths out of their wits. Brendel felt the roots of his teeth turning sour. In the Jianghu Ridge's underground purgatory, the Lord of Spiked Chains was one level higher than the Cerberus. It was a level 29 demon. Previously, when he went to the lava pool area to train at level 30, he suffered a lot from these guys. He did not expect that the shadow of his childhood would repeat itself today. However, what happened next did not give him time to deal with his aching teeth. He saw Rady and the young man turn and run. Brainless idiots. Brando almost jumped up from his seat. How could a level 29 Lord of Spiked Chains have such a bad hit? This was obviously a test. He knew all too well about these cunning guests below. He was almost certain that they were facing a scouting party. However, Rady's escape would probably attract the attention of the disciples of the Black Flames. Of course, he did not care if Rady was dead or alive. The problem was that they were heading in the same direction. Brando immediately patted the Nightsong Tiger's shoulder and roared in a hoarse voice, "Go catch those two brats. Drag them back. P.S. Please give me some support. Anything is good. Students, my results are really disappointing. I feel really lonely when no one cares about me." Chapter 148. Rady and the other mercenary had already turned around and started running. They shouted as they ran towards the camp. The Nightsong Tiger immediately chased after them. His figure was like a shadow that blended into the darkness of the forest. He was not fast, but he was quiet and practiced. It was as if he was a creature that lived in the darkness. When Brando turned around, the sound of chains dragging on the ground could be heard from the forest behind him. The disciples of the Black Flames have discovered the commotion here. I need to use another method. He furrowed his brows. Amandina and the Roman had already taken out their light crossbows from their backpacks. Amandina stared at the forest nervously. Not to mention the other mercenaries, every one of them gently pulled out their weapons and prepared for battle. "My lord?" Amandina asked hesitantly. Brando shook his head. He had already made up his mind. The development of the situation had exceeded his expectations, and he had to salvage the situation as soon as possible. He put his hand into his pocket, and when he took it out again he was holding a crystal that was used for illumination. The crystal lit up in an instant. A soft light bloomed from the youth's hand. "My lord?" Amandina's eyes widened. "Brando." The Roman was also stunned. Everyone's attention was attracted by the light that appeared in the darkness. It was like a fluorescent light in the endless darkness. The light expanded rapidly, but it was quickly thrown away. The fluorescent light drew an arc in the darkness. The arc passed through a forest and landed in a dense thicket. Even though there were layers of cover, the light from the thicket still illuminated a small area nearby. There were 3 humans in black robes with hoods covering their faces. They did not expect to be exposed and were stunned. Amandina could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Beside each of the 3 stood a terrifying creature that was about half the height of a human. It had a pair of goat hooves, horns, and fangs and was about the same height as a human. The ankles of these creatures were connected to the wrists of the disciples of the Black Flame by a black chain. Their bodies were covered with strange black patterns. Those were the restraining power of contracts and spells. There was no doubt that these were the underworld visitors of Jianghu Ridge, the lowest level of the pack demons. That high-level pack demon is in the opposite direction. The mercenaries of Lopez behind immediately shouted. As the collective of the most legendary mercenaries, of course, they would have had dealings with the most evil forces in the world. They were already familiar with the habits of these fellows. However, Brando was more familiar with it than they were. As soon as he saw the 3 of them, he raised his hand in another direction. The silver ring on his index finger glowed, and Brando immediately chanted the spell, Oas. The airflow was like a line that exploded forward in a visible range. With a loud bang, the surrounding pine trees were instantly snapped and toppled to the outside, and those that blocked the front were all turned into powder. After the hurricane passed, the forest no longer existed, forming an open corridor in front of Brando. The mercenary's eyes were filled with reverence. The noble lady screamed and covered her ears as she squatted down. At that moment, there was only one voice in her mind. He is a wizard. He is a wizard. This young knight is actually a wizard. The Roman lady tilted her head, and as expected, she saw Brando's figure flash, and his whole body blurred for a moment before disappearing from the spot. Only the mercenaries of Lopez were able to clearly see that Brando's speed was at least 10 times faster than his usual speed. It was as if he left a continuous trail of shadows behind him, and then disappeared from sight. That's the Sun Knight's charge skill. A mercenary behind immediately said. However, they were not the same as those undisciplined third-rate mercenaries. As soon as the mercenaries finished speaking, one of them unsheathed his sword and walked out from the group. He pointed his sword in the direction where the illuminating crystal fell and ordered, I, Vice Captain Rocco, will take over the command. I order you to immediately attack those disciples of the Black Flame. Yes, sir. 11 figures immediately rushed towards the 3 disciples of the Black Flame who were still in a daze. On the other side, the charge skill allowed Brando to catch the Lord of Thorns in an instant. This crimson-red demon was standing together with its master, a man wearing a red robe. The Lord of Thorny Chains looked a bit like a large crimson-packed demon, but it had a pair of huge fleshy wings and 2 pairs of long horns. Its appearance was more similar to the classic images of demons in medieval legends. Other than that, there were also a bunch of barbed chains around its body. However, this demon seemed to be heavily injured. Not only was it missing an arm, but it was also missing a wing. Brando did not find this strange. Although the Ring of the Wind Empress was only a 10-ounce equipment, its power was definitely enough to kill non-defensive creatures below level 30. Otherwise, it would not be called a small divine weapon. In the game, the only thing that was criticized about it was that its cooldown was too long. As for demon-type creatures, other than the Blade Demon, which was a mid-tier troop, there were no other defense-type creatures. Brando looked at the man again and narrowed his eyes. A high-ranking member of the Disciples of the Black Flame. His figure turned in midair, and a long sword appeared in his hand. Unlike the battle with Buga, he did not dare to hold back. Although the Disciple of the Black Flames was only level 21, the Lord of the Spiked Chains was a level 29 demon. White Raven Sword. Brendel swung his sword from top to bottom and activated Power Burst. A wind blade blossomed from his sword. The Disciple of the Black Flames was still checking on the injuries of his contracted demon. He did not expect the enemy to arrive so quickly. The moment he raised his head, the translucent ripple of the sword had already pierced through his chest. Brando was no longer the weak young man he was a month ago. A level 21 character was like a boss to him a month ago, but this disciple could not take a full blow from him. The disciple screamed and flew out with a trail of blood. According to the rules of the game, once the person who signed the contract died, the demon would regain its freedom. But the backlash from the contract would cause the bloodthirsty creature to descend into a mindless frenzy. That's what I'm facing right now. When he landed, he lowered his head and saw a chain sweeping across his back. Ouch. Brando felt a burning pain on his back. My speed is at least 20% faster. Berserk state. Looks like the disciple is dead. That thought flashed through his mind. At the same time, he knew that a layer of skin on his back had been swept away. He could not help but curse. Even though he was cursing, Brendel still grabbed the chain with a backhand. Ignoring the piercing pain in his hand, he flew towards the devil's direction. Even though the Lord of Thorny Chains was a high-level demon, it was a man-made low-level demon in Jorgendy Ridge. It did not have a complete soul and lacked intelligence. Not to mention it was already in a frenzy. It did not expect that its action of pulling back the chain would attract a killing god. Brando borrowed the disciple's strength and pushed his sword forward. The sword had already pierced the disciple's eye. His movements were very smooth, as if he had practiced this action hundreds of times. In fact, he had practiced this action hundreds of times, but that was in the game. The Lord of Thorny Chains, who had its eye heavily injured, raised its head and howled. The low growl echoed through the forest. The young man frowned and lightly landed on the disciple's shoulder. He immediately turned his sword around and slit the monster's neck. Blue blood spurted out. The high-level demon's howl suddenly stopped and turned into a gurgling sound. It struggled and finally fell to the ground. Brando let out a sigh of relief. He first retrieved the experience points without checking if there were any drops. The disciples of the Black Flames were famous for being poor, so he did not want to deal with them. He raised his head and saw that his subordinates had successfully defeated the other disciples of the Black Flames. But this did not mean that it was over. He had already noticed that there was a commotion in the forest. Whether it was the direction of the Grey Wolves mercenaries' camp or the opposite direction. Damn it! He cursed under his breath. At the same time, he ordered his summoned creatures in his mind, prepare to retreat. Bring those two guys away. He then lowered his head and looked at the huge red monster on the ground. It was on its last breath, but it was not completely dead. Demons were known for their tenacity in the game. They were known as the three most hated types of monsters along with the undead and plant-type monsters. Thinking about this, Brando suddenly felt that he was unlucky. He suddenly remembered what he had encountered since he came to this world. Skeletons, the golden demonic tree, and these demons. It seemed that he had encountered the big three, not to mention that his main enemy was Madara, which was obviously a group of undead skeletons. Could it be that Mother Marcia was playing a joke on him? He could not help but laugh at himself. But at this time lines of small, ghostly green text suddenly appeared in Brando's vision. Target creature's contract has been cancelled. Target creature is in an extremely weak state. Condition met. Sign a contract with me? Yes/no. Brando was slightly taken aback when he saw the rows of notifications. He could not help but shudder and then shook his head resolutely. Absolutely not. When Reedy and his companions were tossed to the ground, the white-haired youth raised his head and glared at everyone present with his usual arrogance. But when he saw that it was Brando and the others, his pupils constricted and he struggled to stand up. But the Nightsong Tiger pressed one hand on his shoulder and the other on his neck. The oppressive force forced him to bend his body, but he still glared at Brando with his silver-gray eyes. He was like a wolf that had not been tamed. He struggled and growled, "So it was you. I knew you were up to no good. Ugh, cough cough." But Brando did not have time to talk nonsense with him and punched him in the face. The force behind the punch was so strong that Rady could not help but turn his head back and cough out a mouthful of blood. Amandina could not help but gasp. Romaine blinked a few times, thinking that Brendel would lose his temper too. Just like the last time when he was with Freya, but that was in the Golden Tree Canyon. But she was more concerned about Brando's hand. The youth's hand was covered in blood from the battle with the Lord of Spiked Chains. Romaine felt a little pain in her heart, but she wanted to go over and help bandage it, but the youth did not let her touch him. The spikes of the Lord of Spiked Chains were poisonous. Brendel understood that his constitution was high, and he had no problem resisting the poison. But little Romaine was different, and he did not want to accidentally label this merchant lady as sickly. The Lord of Spiked Chains' poison was harmful to vitality. On the other side, the white-haired youth immediately turned his head back with blood at the corner of his mouth. He stared at Brendel with a vicious glare. Brendel also looked at him. The battle just now had attracted the attention of both sides, and now the forest not far away was in a mess. If he did not react quickly, they would probably be stuck there and unable to get out. But even now they were not necessarily safe. That was why Brando was so angry. Your enemy is not us. If you don't want to die, don't move. He looked at the youth and said coldly. Rady clenched his teeth. He understood that Brando's group was not in the same group as those in the forest. But he was furious. He thought that this bastard was using his power to take revenge. He only explained after punching him. He was obviously teaching him a lesson. But even so, he still thought that Brando was just trying to scare them. Others might not know, but he knew that the Grey Wolves mercenary group was far more than a simple mercenary group. Perhaps others were worried about the possibility of fighting with the Paper Cards mercenary group, but he was not worried at all. He just did not think that those bastards would dare to strike first. Rady spat in his heart, thinking that this country bumpkin was making a fuss over nothing. He raised his head and gave Brendel a disdainful look. Brando looked at the other person and was stunned. It was a girl. Her eyes were closed, and her long black hair framed her pale face under the moonlight. But Brendel was surprised that she did not show any signs of panic even in such a situation. Who is she? The thought flashed through his mind. But at this moment the Nightsong Tiger asked, It's the disciples of the Black Flames. My lord, what do we do next? Disciples of the Black Flames? Rady's heart skipped a beat. Brendel glanced at the mountains in the north and lowered his eyes. Let's go east. The white-haired youth could not help but laugh. He was born in a noble military family, so he was quite knowledgeable. He thought that since the Paper Cards mercenary group was so close to this location, it meant that the sentries on the mountain in the north had been removed. If that was the case, the south would be much safer. Rady was obviously a layman, yet he pretended to be an expert. He laughed in his heart as he thought that it must be hard on his subordinates. Rady obviously thought that Brando was a spoiled brat, but when the Night Song Tiger attacked, he did not even have time to react before he was captured. It left a deep impression on him. But even though he was laughing, Rady was still worried about the disciples of the Black Flames. He secretly glanced at the mercenary beside Brando and thought that he would not lie. It was not realistic for him to get information from his fellow mercenaries, so he had to find a chance to get something out of this spoiled brat. He thought of this and looked at Brando again. But unlike Rady, the Night Song Tiger was interested in Brando's words. "My lord, have you dealt with the disciples of the Black Flames before?" "Something like that." Brando casually replied, "I've dealt with the high-ranking priests of the disciples of the Black Flames in the northern mountains." He added in his heart, "In the game, oh?" The Night Song Tiger's eyes lit up. "High-ranking priests?" Cough cough. Why don't you say that you've met the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders?" Rady couldn't help but laugh. The priests of the disciples of the Black Flames are at least at the silver rank. If I'm not mistaken, even Erwin's Imperial Guards would not dare to easily defeat their high-ranking priests. "May I ask which army did you meet them in?" After he finished, he looked at Brando with contempt. "Even if you want to brag, you should come up with a draft. Also, if you want to go to the south, let me go. I don't want to die with you." This guy was really stubborn. After listening to Rady's ridicule, Brando couldn't help but laugh. "Not only did I meet one of the 12 patriarchs, I even killed one of them. You won't believe me even if I tell you. What's so special about the 12 patriarchs? When he was at his peak, he was at the level of an Oracle Knight. In other words, in the Tree Herders and the Unifying Guild, there were only one or two people who could match him. No matter what game it was, the players would only get stronger." However, Brando wasn't in the mood to explain this to Rady. He smiled at him and asked with a dangerous tone, "It seems like you still don't know where you stand?" Rady choked and realized that he had no right to speak. It didn't matter if the person in front of him was just a fox pretending to be a tiger. He snorted coldly and didn't reply. However, Brando didn't mind him being a mute. He turned around and asked, "Who are you?" This time he looked at the girl. Rady glanced over and turned his head to the side. "My name is Yura, Mr. Knight," the girl said. "You know I'm not a merchant?" Brando was stunned. "I know more. I know that our mercenary group is in danger right now. Sir, you can help us, right?" The girl nodded in acknowledgement and continued to ask, "Yura?" This time it was the white-haired youth's turn to be shocked. Who's that?" Yura asked. Brando was really curious this time. He couldn't help but look at the man again. "How did you know?" "P.S. Although it's only one chapter, it's a lot. 5,300 words. If you want to know what will happen next, please log on to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 149. How did you know? Brando turned his head and looked at Yura, who was kneeling on the ground covered with a thick layer of needles. He quickly noticed that the girl's hair was a beautiful pure black, and not Amandina's deep black with a hint of purple. A hint of surprise flashed in his eyes. Amandina's purplish hair and eyes probably came from the bloodline that was closest to the Myernas, the Tyrithians or the half-demons. Even though the Myernas were long gone, the bloodline that was born between the two races had been passed down. After generations of enmity, the bloodline had gradually melted into the vast majority of the human race. The hatred of the past had gradually faded away. But this girl named Yura did not seem to be from this bloodline, even though she had the same black hair and eyes. "I don't know either, Mr. Knight. Perhaps it's a premonition. Pi Conrad's mercenary band and the disciples of the Black Flames have never had any contact, but they appeared together tonight. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, but I'm more willing to believe that this is a premeditated scheme. Mr. Brando, right? I believe that when people are attacked, they would gather together with their own people. Even though we are not worthy of your trust, it's still better than having enemies on the other side. But all of you chose to stay away without hesitation. This is the best way to protect yourselves. Yura closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the battle between the Grey Wolves mercenaries and the disciples of the Black Flames. Her tone was neither fast nor slow. But if we think about it from another perspective, it means that Mr. Brando has analyzed the situation clearly. You must have noticed that another mercenary band has been tailing us. She spoke with certainty. If that's the case, Mr. Brando still chose to head east. I believe that Mr. Brendel is not a rash person since you can make such a decisive decision. If a truly wise person knows what lies ahead, but still continues to press forward, that is bravery. But compared to this, I'm more willing to believe that Mr. Brando knows the situation clearly. I don't know what lies in the east, but is that the way out? Mr. Brando? As for why I said that Mr. Brando is a knight, she smiled slightly. Because I just happened to hear how the young lady addressed you. Because I was born blind, Lady Martha gave me a better sense of hearing. It's not something to brag about. Yura smiled modestly. Amandina let out a soft, ah, and looked at Yura warily. Yura raised her head. Even though she could not see Brando's face, she still asked seriously, Mr. Brendel's help me. Mr. Brendel, you must be able to help our mercenary group, right? Brando took a deep breath. If Amandina could be considered a qualified aide, then this girl in front of him was simply a monster. Her intuition told Brendels of the Grey Wolves as Brendel. He looked at Yura's pure black hair, dark brown eyes and light yellow skin. Every detail on her thin, feathery eyebrows seemed to carry the unique aura of a place he was familiar with. I also have a question. Your surname is Huang, right? Brendel asked. Yura could not open her eyes, otherwise they would be filled with shock. She touched her chest and paused for a moment before letting out a sigh of relief. Of course, her small action did not escape Brando's eyes. He frowned slightly as if he thought of something. But Yura nodded in the end. Yes, my surname is Huang. My real name is Huang Yu. I can see that Mr. Brando is very knowledgeable. My appearance can't fool someone who is truly knowledgeable. It's just that I don't want to talk about the past anymore. Mr. Knight, can you let me go on this matter? Brando nodded. He only guessed the girl's real name based on some details of her appearance. After all, there was only one place in the world with such skin and hair color that was so similar to the Han people in the past. It was the kingdom of the 9 phoenixes in the desert. It was said that the kingdom of the 9 phoenixes was ruled by 9 different races, and there was a legendary high-level sword skill called Sword of the Red Lotus of Hellfire. However, it was only a legend, and many players who went there to try their luck did not find anything. As for Erwin and Cruz, there were many 9 phoenixes walking around like elves from the north. It was not uncommon in this world for people to travel to a foreign land far away from their homeland for reasons of travel, pilgrimage, or simply adventure. Brando touched his forehead and felt that the name was familiar. But he still shook his head at Yura's request. I'm sorry, but we can't help you. In fact, I'll be frank with you. These disciples of the Black Flames won't cause any trouble for your leader, but if Makarov the maned wolf is wise, or if I were him, I'd leave this place immediately. You. Rady raised his head and glared at Brendel as if he wanted to eat him alive. You can't just leave like that. The mercenary document says. But the Nightsong Tiger punched him in the stomach, and the white-haired youth bent over in pain. He then shook his head in disdain. Your leader doesn't seem to care about this agreement even now. You have to admit that. Do you understand? Yura nodded. What do you want, Mr. Brando? She asked. Money? Or power? Brando paused for a moment, but he immediately shook his head. I'm interested in these things, but compared to money and power, I don't want to get involved in trouble. Let me give you a hint. The Black Flames mercenaries are backed by the tree herders. Do you know them? Yura and Rady's expressions changed. Why are we being targeted by them? Rady asked in disbelief. Yura's expression changed again and she lowered her head. Amandina poked him from behind and whispered, My lord, the more you scare them, isn't it obvious that you want them to beg for your help? Won't that be the opposite of what you want? Brando shrugged. I don't want to lie to them. He could only explain under Amandina's suspicious gaze. It's not that I can't help them, but I won't get myself involved. I'm just stating this. Then what should we do? The Roman blinked and asked. They have to rely on themselves. Is that even possible? Amandina clearly did not believe him. Of course. Mr. Brando, what should we do? Yura heard their conversation and understood that Brando was reminding them on purpose. She hesitated for a moment as if she was considering whether she could trust him. However, Brando knew that the tree herder's bomb was definitely not an ordinary bomb. Compared to the unifying guild's small operations to subvert countries, the tree herders had used their own strength to start the First Holy War. That story was probably a terrifying shadow for most people who lived in this era. Of course, this was a digression. Brando did not have the time nor the inclination to explain how terrifying the tree herders were to these two rookies. After all, they had grown up listening to bedtime stories about the First Holy War. Yura might be slightly better, but the white-haired young man, Rady, would definitely not have a good impression of such a name. He turned around and saw that the young man seemed to have fallen into a daze. He did not know what to do. "Didn't I say?" Brando replied, "Go and tell your leader to retreat immediately and leave this place. From the current situation, the tree herders have their eyes on you. However, they have a habit of being vigilant. Once they realize that you might have discovered their intentions, they will probably retreat and rearrange their plans. This way you'll have one valuable time. As for what to do after that, I think your leader will know what to do." Rather than saying that Brando's analysis was clear and logical, it was more accurate to say that he was reading from a book. Although the strategy guide in his memory had omitted some details, the general direction was very clear. The tree herders had their eyes on the Grey Wolves mercenaries. As for why, Brando naturally did not know. However, not knowing did not mean that he did not have a solution. He had dealt with the tree herders for as long as he had dealt with the skeletons in Madara. He had plenty of ways to deal with them. Yura and Rady looked at each other. "How do we know if you're telling the truth?" Rady frowned and muttered softly. "I'm not forcing you to believe me. Aren't you being too irresponsible?" The white-haired youth snorted. "We don't have any obligation to be responsible. Do you understand the current situation? Master is helping you out of kindness. Of course, you can choose not to accept it if you have the guts." Amandina had long found this person annoying. At this time she could no longer hold it in and spoke sarcastically. After she finished speaking, she suddenly paused. She could not help but look apologetically at Yura, who was kneeling on the ground. "I'm sorry, I meant, don't mind." Yura shook her head. She had been lowering her head the whole time and no one knew what she was thinking. She only opened her mouth and asked, "So Mr. Brando still wants to do things his way and leave this place, right?" Brando nodded. "Even if we ask you to stay, you can't?" Brando nodded again. He had his own reasons. He had already gotten himself into trouble with the unifying guild. If he had to bear the burden of the tree herders, he would not be able to rest in peace even if he died. But on the other hand, he knew that Buga and Makarov would not die in this quest. Even though he knew that he did not have the strength to subdue them, he still had to express his goodwill. Even if he chose to leave under these circumstances, he would not be letting down the Grey Wolves mercenaries. The agreement between the two parties was as fragile as it looked, but if he left, it would be troublesome if he wanted to pick it up again. No matter if it was for the two powerful people or the future Courage quest line, he did not have to establish a good relationship with them. But as a veteran player, Brendel had already weighed the pros and cons in his heart if it was worth risking his life for this little benefit. "Mr. Brando, are you willing to let us go?" Yura asked again. "I didn't intend to capture you. I was actually saving you. Miss Yura, you should understand this." Brando replied. Yura nodded. "But aren't you afraid that we will expose you if you let us go?" Brando smiled and replied confidently, "You won't be able to catch up to us." He wasn't joking. The guide had at least 4 shortcuts and trails in the area, although the map was a little rough. But it was not a problem for a veteran player like him. Rady glanced at him and did not reply. However, it was obvious from his expression that this unruly white-haired youth didn't believe his words at all. In his heart, he believed that he was just bragging. Even though he was shocked by Brando's words, he remembered that this guy had made a fool of himself. What did he mean by, "go east"? He was clearly a layman. This thought seemed to make him feel more at ease. He then thought that he had to persuade Yura to not be fooled by this guy. P.S. What a strong person. I actually managed to rush out a chapter before 12 o'clock. I'll try my best to write more chapters later. Please support me. Chapter 150. Amandina looked at the back of the limping youth and Yura's calm figure. She could not help but ask, "You're letting them go just like that, my lord?" "What else can I do? The less trouble, the better." Brando answered simply. "But I feel like you're plotting something." Amandina glanced at him suspiciously. Brando could not help but smile bitterly and touch the tip of his nose. "I'm not that bad in your eyes, am I? I remember that I've always done things in an open and above-board manner." "Yes, but I think that my lord's actions are never as simple as they seem on the surface, isn't it?" You arranged for Miss Freya to go to the Royal Cavalry Academy in Brags. On the surface, it seems like you're supporting each other, but in private I think you're paying attention to the conflict between the royal faction and the local nobles. Am I right? If I remember correctly, the Royal Cavalry Academy is in the private territory of the eldest princess. Among the descendants of His Majesty, rumor has it that the eldest princess is the most outstanding. Moreover, I heard that the eldest princess and the only heir to the throne, the cowardly little prince, have always acted as a guardian and sister. That's how it is. After His Majesty, it's not impossible for the eldest princess to seize power and become the regent. In this way, Sir Overlord's actions will become an invisible investment. Roman heard the word investment, and quickly nodded. In other words, these hidden investments may not have any effect at first. But once you have your own lord, you will naturally become a member of the faction that supports the eldest princess. Of course, I wouldn't think so much if it were a normal person. But from my lord's actions, perhaps others don't know, but those close to you know that your ambition is not as simple as just a little bit. Amandina raised her head. Isn't that right, my lord? The girl finished speaking in one breath and let out a sigh. In fact, she was just pouring out the guesses she had over the past few days. She could not understand Brando's actions recently, and she did not want to fall too far behind her lord, especially as the chief of staff. Brando blinked and said, something like that. However, he knew that this young lady from a noble family had not guessed everything correctly. In particular, it was an investment, but it was more like a connection. In fact, he did not need the title of righteous. He just needed to bury his head in farming. After all, the players were different from the lords in this world. Moreover, he still had the territory under his control. As long as he waited for the civil strife to reach its fiercest stage, he could take the opportunity to expand. When Madara began to invade Erewhon, and when Her Royal Highness could no longer control the situation, he could wait until then to step out and seize the greatest benefits. But he did not do so. His feelings for the game made him send the future Valkyrie to the princess side. He believed that the two most outstanding women in Erewhon's history would not disappoint him. That way, even if his prediction was wrong, at least he wouldn't have any regrets. However, he did not expect Amandina to understand his intentions in such a way. He could not help but smile, but he did not say anything. To be able to guess to this extent already showed the young lady's intelligence. He looked back at the Roman, and the young lady looked back at him as if it was fun. However, she did not look surprised at all. She did not even need to understand why Brando did this. She would only do her best to help him. This was the biggest difference between the Roman and Amandina. Brando thought that sometimes being too clear-headed might not necessarily lead to happiness. Thus, he looked at the Roman, and saw the latter's expression that was always natural. It was also a kind of pleasure. Then next, Amandina replied, participate in the auction to raise funds and sponsor the Roman to participate in the celebration after the war. On the surface, the transfer of funds under the surface is actually a deep infiltration of a region. This is also the first time I found out that gold is a good thing. With its omnipresent power, the Romans' tentacles are like moisturizing things silently, and the originally intricate lower-class citizens controlled by the nobles and thieves' guilds, we don't even need to deliberately manage and maintain it, and we can hear voices from all sides. During Bragg's operation, I originally wanted to communicate with the Thieves' Guild to obtain this information, but I didn't think that I had already fallen into a disadvantage in your eyes. She raised her head and asked. This is also one of the original intentions of establishing a merchant guild, Brando nodded honestly, but it is not the power of money but the power of interests. People will unconsciously categorize themselves into a certain system. Even if it is only for selfish purposes, but often the things they do will benefit others, just like the circulation of goods. This is a wonderful phenomenon. Gathering information is actually not that difficult. My aunt said that rumors are always everywhere. The Romans seemed to be very interested in this topic and answered. That is because we do not have high requirements for the quality of information. The most difficult part of processing information is not the collection, but the screening of useful information. This requires a large number of professionals. Brando smiled. That's a different story. But that is why I suspect that my lord has other motives. Isn't it a very normal guess? My lord, you never do things that do not benefit you. Amandina's eyelashes fluttered slightly as she stared at him. These two things don't mean anything, it is just a coincidence. Brando did not want to be entangled with this intelligent girl on this topic. After all, he had too many secrets, and a lie often required more lies to cover it up. The more you speak, the more likely you will be exposed. Then the matter of the Red Copper Dragon mercenary group retreating behind the scenes. On the surface, it was to keep a low profile. But it was later proven that it was to arrange for Freya to enter the Royal Cavalry Academy. My lord, you seem to have always known about the few places for the Royal Cavalry Academy? The girl blinked and her suspicions deepened. No, it is not just that. My lord, you seem to be able to see further than normal people. While we are still struggling with the benefits in front of us, you seem to have already seen the final result. I don't know if this is a talent, but it really puts a lot of pressure on me. She sighed and could not help but complain. All right, Brando hurriedly waved his hand. I understand. Let's just take it that way. You are right, this is a talent. But after all, a person's considerations are not always comprehensive. He raised his head and looked. Battles under the night sky were always inseparable from fire. The fire had already started to burn from the direction of the camp, and the sky in the north was faintly glowing, gradually changing into a layer of magnificent light red. As the battle gradually reached its climax, the direction they were in also became unsafe. After all, it was only a temporary shelter. It seems like I have said too much off topic. Let's hurry and leave this place before we are affected by the battle. Brando looked around and changed the topic. After he finished speaking, he did not give the girl a chance to ask further and had already grabbed his long sword that was chipped in the previous battle and fled. To be honest, Amandina's sharpness was far beyond his imagination. He was really worried that if she continued to ask, she would even copy out his identity card number. Only the heavens knew why he had such foresight in this world. Could it be that he was a transmigrator? And not just any transmigrator? Obviously, Brando would not make such a low-level mistake. Of course, his crude method of changing the topic did not escape Amandina's eyes, but she seemed to have realized that she had said too much. If it were not for the fact that she had more and more questions in the past few days, she would not have felt so uncomfortable. But she also understood that there was a limit to everything, and it was natural for a superior to hide certain things from his followers. Moreover, Brando's foresight had always been the source of her confidence in this small group. Thinking of this, she obediently followed him. But when it came to this, she could not help but turn back and ask in a low voice, Mr. Nightsong Tiger, is it all right if we leave from the east? She remembered that when Brando was speaking, the white-haired youth called Rady was obviously hiding something from them. Although almost everyone's attention was on Brando at that time, the cautious young lady did not miss this detail. The Nightsong Tiger looked at her with a smile full of admiration. Of course. He replied as if it was not enough. He patted his left arm like a real Lopez Mountain man and assured her, Miss Amanda, I have never seen a young man who is as familiar with these damned bastards as my lord. I'm not being modest, we have always dealt with them. The disciples of the Black Flames have always liked to create a diversion, but it is not easy to see through their arrangements. The experienced mercenary looked at Brando's back and praised, Even if it's me, I can only judge from the direction of their attack that their ambush should be from the south to the west. But compared to my lord, I'm still lacking. The Nightsong Tiger replied as he pointed at Brando's back with his chin, Do you see my lord's hand? I bet he took less than a minute to deal with that high-level contract demon, maybe within 10 swords. Only a veteran would understand that the fastest way to approach the Lord of Thorns is to attack it. Although this clumsy creature has a wide attack range, it will not be a threat once you get close to it. Amandina didn't really understand, but she could clearly see the old mercenary's admiration for Brando. She did not understand at first, but when she saw that the young knight did not seem to care about the wounds on his hands and back, she seemed to understand something. As far as she knew, there were very few descendants of Erwin's nobles who could endure hardships like their ancestors. Brave and wise, decisive and tenacious. Was there such a lord? She really wanted to see what kind of achievements he would have. Amandina couldn't help but take a deep breath. P.S. I've appeared once again. I'm in a very good state today. Everyone can see that I've worked so hard. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 151. The battle seemed to have ended as soon as it started. Eek was almost certain that the people under the black robes were at least silver magi. He had expected this to happen, but he did not expect the result. He was almost certain that Cabot and the others would die on the spot, and he could not help but draw his sword to stop them. However, the white-haired old man who walked out from behind Cabot just casually pointed his finger, and a few gray rays flashed. The people who were his nightmares turned into a pile of dust. The young man's jaw dropped. He did not know if he was dreaming or not. When the old man cast a spell, the holy earth rune appeared on his palm. Even if Eek was ignorant, he knew that there were no more than 10 people in Erewhon. Among these 10 people, they were either high-ranked magi who had been famous for a long time, or they were lords. The only ones left were the leaders of the Black Tower Council and the Star and Moon Council. Who was he? Then he saw Cabot bow and respectfully say to the old man, "Master Fleetwood, thank you for your hard work." This sentence was like a bolt from the blue, making Eek unable to move forward or backward for a moment, unable to move forward or retreat from the back of the sack. In Erewhon there were many people with the name Fleetwood. However, there was only one person who was qualified to be called a master. Fleetwood? Adwala? Gemmer? The chief court magus of Erewhon, an elder who had assisted Anson VII for 3 generations. Eek's mind was in a mess. He could not understand why he would meet such an important person in such a remote place. It seemed that he was here to help them. This. The young man pointed at the old man. You are? The old man nodded and admitted his guess. He then replied, "It's a long story, Mr. Eek. Let Knight Cabot bring us to a safe place. I'll explain it to you later." Cabot. Knight? Eek looked at Cabot and felt that the world had been turned upside down. Brando and the others walked along the quiet mountain forest to the east. The rustling footsteps of the team of 15 shuffled through the thick grass like an invisible snake slithering through the darkness. When they looked back, they could see the sparks of fire in the forest at the foot of the mountain. There used to be a brightly lit campsite there, but now there were only scattered embers of charcoal in the darkness. "Our horses are still in the camp, Brando?" This was already the 3rd time she had asked this question. Brando knew that the Roman's heart ached for her little pony, so he couldn't help but shake his head with a smile. "They will retreat, won't they, Brando?" The merchant lady's eyes sparkled with the light from the fire below the mountain. She turned her head and lifted her chin as she asked. She knew what Brando meant. But the Roman was still a soft-hearted girl. Even though she knew that she and her aunt were not welcomed by the villagers, the land where they grew up was still considered their homeland. That was why she was willing to help Freya rebuild Bucci. "Only Lady Martha knows about this," Brando answered. Whether or not the Grey Wolves mercenaries would follow in the footsteps of history was not up to him. Instead, it was up to him whether or not he could influence Makarov's opinion. "But they know that this is a trap, so they should be more vigilant." The Roman asked, "Brando, didn't you say that Makarov is a smart man?" "He is too smart." Brando knew that before Makarov became a mercenary, this maned wolf was known as the Cunning Fox. He was once the brains of the royal faction's reformist faction. If not for the political failure 11 years ago, he would not have fallen to this state. "So they are plotting against each other?" Amandina asked. "More or less. I really don't understand why they are doing this." Amandina could not help but raise another hypothesis. Could it be that there is a secret in this forest that is tempting enough? Brando smiled. There was a secret, but it was not tempting enough. Moreover, the 2 sides of the conflict did not care about this point. They were concerned about something else. Amandina saw his smile and immediately asked, "Do you know something, my lord?" Brando nodded. "Do you remember the young man we saw a few days ago?" He said, "His real name should be Eek? Lantern Island? Ophelia?" "That name sounds familiar." "Naturally, then you should have heard of Cannon? Lantern Island? Ophelia?" The Roman and the other mercenaries were fine, but Amandina could not help but choke and cough violently. After a long time, she looked up with a pale face and asked while gasping, "Duke Anthony?" "Eek also has a title, Count Maywak. This is a title with a territory." Brando narrowed his eyes. "It's just that I'm afraid even he doesn't know." "This is..." Amandina could not help but ask, "Is it related to the political struggle 11 years ago?" "Oh right, didn't Duke Anthony's son disappear a long time ago?" She suddenly stopped talking and looked at Brando with a strange expression. "My lord, how do you know so much?" "It's an open secret," Brando said without thinking. "So it's still an open secret. Erewhon is no longer the Erewhon of the past. Its upper echelons are so old that it's not worth repairing. It's even worse, it's beyond cure." Brando looked at the noble girl and deliberately said these words in front of her. "We are not the only ones who have noticed this. Look, Miss Amandina. In less than 3 months, this country will be torn apart. What you're seeing now is just its final struggle." Although these words were not considered treacherous in this world, the ambition contained in them was still obvious. Can the Corvado dynasty still be saved? Amandina asked. She was still thinking of the name that brought glory to Erwin. Maybe there are more. Brendel thought of the regent princess. What should we do, my lord? Amandina interrupted his thoughts and asked in a low voice. Let's find the sage slate first. Brando looked at the rolling mountains in the distance. The mountains intersected with each other, forming different layers of black silhouettes in the dark night. But the young man's gaze seemed to be able to see through these obstacles, as if he had already seen the goal, and answered concisely and powerfully. The young man led the group to the top of the mountain, and the wind suddenly became stronger. It was as if the air from the southern mountain pass had whistled through the forest and lifted his cloak. Brando sniffed the wind and stared at the dark and quiet valley on the other side of the mountain. A trace of surprise flashed in his eyes, but it quickly turned into understanding. It's here. It seems that these people are not joking with me when it comes to key issues. When the others heard this exclamation, they all turned to look at him. Do you see the valley below? Is there a problem? The Roman asked curiously. Brando stretched out a hand from under his cloak and pointed at the valley. But when they looked in the direction he pointed, all they saw was a layer of black carpet that was spread out along the mountain walls on both sides of the forest. But the young man turned his head, and a layer of light flashed in his eyes. Have you heard of altars? Altars. Altars? The Roman answered seriously. When I was young, I saw the altar in the Temple of Flames with my aunt. Is it like that? Of course not. Then you should have heard of the nest, right? Everyone was silent. This was natural. There should be a nest in that valley. What? The mercenary captain standing behind him was shocked. Everyone knew that nests were the war potential of a country. But very few people knew that except for man-made nests, wild nests were dangerous forbidden zones. In fact, humans often had to pay a great price to purify a nest. What level is the nest? He asked immediately. Don't be nervous. Brando signaled him to be quiet. He looked at the entire valley and paused for a moment. That is an altar of order. If I'm not wrong, it is the Temple of Truth. An altar of order? Have you heard of the Gate of Heaven? The mercenaries sucked in a breath of cold air. The mercenaries of Lopez came from the kingdom of knights, Gareth, and naturally understood what this term meant. The Nightsong Tiger looked at the confused faces of Amandina and the Roman, and explained in a low voice, the Angel of Thrones. Amandina gasped and looked at Brando in disbelief. The kingdom of knights was less than a fifth of Erwin's land, but its strength was the strongest among the kingdoms of the Holy Church. This was because it had two of the strongest legions in Wand. The fanatical Heart Knight Legion and the Radiant Royal Legion. In the last Holy War, Erwin, as a subordinate of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, had suffered many losses at the hands of these two legions. The Nightsong Tiger looked at him in disbelief and stuttered, My lord, are you saying that there is a gate of heaven in this valley? Brando immediately shook his head. What a joke, there was no way he would be able to discover a gate of heaven in this valley. The gate of heaven was also known as the Angel's Staircase, and the creatures that were born from it were known as the strongest creatures of the Holy Church, the Angel of Thrones. Moreover, as long as there was a gate to heaven, there would be abnormal signs in the sky within 100 miles. With such obvious signs, unless the local Holy Cathedral of Fire was extremely retarded, there was no way he would be able to get a share of the pie. No, there is an altar of order below that is similar to the gate of heaven. Brando replied. Similar? The mercenary leader was stunned. Although he was the embodiment of the most legendary mercenary in history, he was not a knowledgeable scholar. The nests of all the creatures in this world were in the hands of those in power or local aristocrats. Most people had only heard rumors about them, but most people had neither the qualifications nor the opportunity to understand them. You're saying that this is a nest under the protection of Lady Martha? Amandina keenly grasped Brando's meaning. Brando was taken aback. Even though he had the idea in his mind, he could not help but use the words in the game when he spoke. It could only be said that Sophie's personality always held the initiative when it came to quests and storylines. He smiled bitterly and nodded his head. If that's the case, then it's also a great discovery. The Nightsong Tiger immediately said. Because wild nests were too difficult to purify, transforming a nest that was contaminated with magic was not something that could be done in a day. The entire process could take up to 10 or 20 years. However, nests under the protection of Martha were different. They were gifts from God to the world, and the creatures of order that were born from them were natural allies of intelligent beings. Often, the owner of the nest only needed to pay for the daily expenses and a small reward, and the owner of the nest could obtain a powerful army from the altar of order. Therefore, in any kingdom, as long as they reported any altar of order to the Holy Cathedral of Fire, they would be able to obtain a rich territory that was close to 3 or 4 knight dominions. And it was a hereditary territory. Amandina, who was always calm, became excited when she thought of this. She looked at Brando. But Brando waved his hand. "You're thinking too much. That's just an abandoned altar." "Abandoned?" Amandina was stunned, but she quickly asked, "How do you know, my lord?" Brando did not answer. He already knew that there was an altar of order in this direction, but he did not know the specific location. With his experience, if he could not confirm this point at this distance, then he would have lived in vain. He had once joined the Kingdom of Knights, Grace, as a player. Even before he came to this world he was still a player. Therefore, he was all too familiar with the sacred and tranquil aura that permeated a certain range around the altar of order. What's more, a light screen had popped up in his vision earlier, indicating that he had entered the range of this sanctuary. As for why he knew that it was abandoned, wasn't it written in the guide? The group went down the valley. The side of the slope that they slid down seemed to have blocked out all the sounds from the other side. The valley was silent, and even the most common sound of insects in the summer could not be heard. Walking in the dark forest under the starlight, there were no obvious paths in the forest between the valleys. The group walked in the rugged, mossy forest, looking left and right, occasionally seeing flashes of light in the darkness. Those were the eyes of fireflies or just the eyes of animals. It was not the first time that Amandina and Roman traveled at night, so although they were nervous, they were not too afraid. The mercenaries of Lopez were even more calm. If the legendary mercenaries who had braved through fire and water were afraid of the dark, it would be too funny. But the environment here was indeed a little strange. I wasn't the one who discovered this altar. With the help of the dim starlight, Brendel saw some man-made rock fragments gradually appearing on the ground of the moss-covered forest where the roots intertwined with each other. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 152. Scarlet. A clear voice called out from the forest, accompanied by hurried footsteps. It sounded like a group of people was approaching them. The girl with light red long hair pressed a hand on the back of her head and turned around. Her thick eyelashes brushed, and her nearly translucent wine-like eyes reflected a ball of fire not far away. Sparks danced in the air and her gloomy eyes flickered. She seemed a little confused. From the sound of it, it seems like Celia and the others. Didn't they go to look for Yura and Reedy? Why are they back? Did they find them or did they run into some trouble? The girl called Scarlet vigilantly raised the halberd in her hand, or rather, the halberd. If Brando was here he would definitely be able to recognize the halberd. Apart from the foot-long, pitch-black blade, the spindle-shaped blade was one of the most eye-catching features of the weapon. The sharp edge of the blade spread out along the golden edge, making it look exceptionally beautiful. However, beautiful things were always dangerous. This halberd was known as Lightning Lance, Logos, and was one of the most famous drops in the Chablis region. It was a must-have weapon for spear mercenaries. Even though it was only a level 25 halberd, its price had always been high on a few famous trading websites. There was no other reason other than the 1% chance that the user of this halberd would receive the Lightning Whisper special effect when attacking. The effect originated from the Elementalist spell of the same name. It would grant the user 10% lightning damage, which was equivalent to increasing the user's elemental damage by 10%. That was why the spear mercenaries had a tactic. They would first use the lightning lance to activate its effect, then use it with the mercenaries' instant battle preparation skill to instantly switch to their main weapon, Asterisk. They would then use the wind elemental sensing potion, attribute strengthening crystal and other consumable items to deal damage. Asterisk. The difference between a mercenary and a warrior was that a warrior focused on technique while a mercenary focused on battle. The latter viewed their weapons as tools. This was the so-called elemental damage type. However, it was rumored that the Lightning Lance, Logos, was owned by a spirit knight in the northern forest of Chablis. How did it end up in the girl's hands was an unsolved mystery. If Brando saw it now he would probably be surprised as well. The first Lightning Lance, Logos, appeared in the Year of the Swift, 377. Before the Year of the Summer Leaves and Flowers, 375, the forest to the north of Chablis was still occupied by lizard men bandits, wasn't it? Scarlet raised her head and saw a few people rushing out of the forest. She frowned. To the girl, the Grey Wolves mercenaries had a different meaning. She was an orphan who was adopted by Cabot, and this mercenary group was more like a huge family to her. Every time she fought, it was not for money but to protect her family. However, other than fighting, she felt that she didn't know what else to do. There was only battle. However, for the past 11 years, the Grey Wolves mercenaries had been winning again and again. Everyone's confidence grew day by day, and gradually, it became a sense of honor. But this pride was met with a painful blow tonight. Scarlet did not understand where these enemies came from, but there was no doubt that they were extremely difficult to deal with, and their fighting spirit was terrifyingly tenacious. She had a bad premonition in her heart. Nervousness and exhaustion made her young heart pound in her chest. What's wrong? Scarlet, Yura has been found. The young girl let out a low sigh and her eyes flashed. She put down her halberd and swung her long hair. Then she pressed her hand against her hair and asked, "So? What did the leader say? Should we continue forward or retreat?" The crowd snickered. Everyone in the mercenary group knew that the red-haired girl had a good impression of Eek, but the few people involved were kept in the dark. It was a pity that this secret admiration could only be buried in the bottom of their hearts. Since Yura was Eek's fiancée, her relationship with that woman was not necessarily good. But Yura is Xingjian and she's smart. I think the leader would like her more. Scarlet pretended not to care and snorted lightly. Then she raised her head and glared at them. "Be careful, your mouths might rot," she said fiercely. But the laughter grew louder. Someone said amidst the kind laughter, "Scarlet, the leader has decided to advance to the northeast. You, Reedy, and Roller, the 3 captains, will each lead a group to pave the way. We'll go with you, okay?" Scarlet suddenly grinned. "Why do you want to go with me? You have ulterior motives, don't you?" "Why would we?" The few who were seen through quickly waved their hands. She raised her head and glared at one of the youths, who quickly lowered his head. "Idiot." Scarlet snorted inwardly. "Up to you." She turned around and answered. The youths looked at the girl's back blankly for a moment. They did not understand the girl's worries. The strength of paper cards far exceeded their expectations, but why didn't Captain Makarov give the order to retreat? Why did he insist on carrying out the original plan? Was it because he had a card up his sleeve, or was it because of some other reason? Scarlet pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beating rapidly. But since the leader had given the order, she had no grounds to disobey. She could only rely on the halberd in her hand. She tightened her grip on the halberd. It was a gift Eek bought from a merchant for her 15th birthday. She had long since made up her mind to fight with this halberd until the very end, even if it meant losing her life. Sometimes she even felt that this was the meaning of her life. But after walking for a while, she thought of something else. She tilted her head and asked, "I remember that the merchant was camping here. Why don't I see him?" "Maybe they got separated," the youths hesitantly answered as they followed her. After all, they were not the maned wolf, Makarov's trusted subordinates. In fact, not everyone in the Grey Wolves mercenary group knew of his identity. Most of them thought that they were only in a temporary alliance on the surface. Scarlet frowned. "Then let's search in this direction." "Is that all right?" "Why not? The Grey Wolves mercenaries can't be called a traitor." Scarlet replied. The youths behind her laughed again. She was obviously soft-hearted, but she had to find a dignified excuse. They were willing to follow her mostly because they wanted to see her make a fool out of herself. Of course, it was mostly out of goodwill. But just as Scarlet finished her words, another strange laughter came from the forest. The laughter sounded like the squeaking of the scarecrows that the mercenaries had seen in the manor of the nobles in the flatlands east of Randner. It was hollow, dull, and filled with a sense of terror. Scarlet's expression changed as she looked up. She immediately saw the person wearing a black robe with red edges standing on top of a tree. On the other side of this person, there was a huge green beast entrenched on top of a black pine tree. The monster had the head of a goat, and a pair of fleshy wings drooped down, revealing spiked black metal chains wrapped around its wings. When did it come? Scarlet was shocked and frowned. Even though she did not know what it was, she knew that it was a tough opponent. "Little girl." The disciple wearing the black robe laughed and said with a sharp voice, "You said someone got separated from here? It has nothing to do with you." Scarlet raised her axe and gritted her teeth. In this ambush, the Grey Wolves mercenaries lost a team of sentries, and one of them was her sister who had a good relationship with her. Even though mercenaries were used to life and death, It did not mean that she could live peacefully with the enemy who caused it. Life and death were the mercenaries' choices. But an enemy was an enemy and she could not live under the same sky. It doesn't matter. It seems that one of my comrades died in the hands of those people. I'll vent my anger on you first. The disciple laughed strangely and said, Abachils? With a clang, a pitch-black iron chain swept through the air towards the young girl. Scarlet grunted and sent the chain flying with her spear. However, the strength of the response from her arm made her secretly surprised. It was only one blow, but it had already made her entire right arm faintly numb. However, her performance was also out of the expectations of the disciple. Silver rank. Makarov's subordinates are indeed filled with hidden dragons and crouching tigers. I didn't expect a little girl like you to have such strength. There are many things that you can't imagine. Logo's lightning arrow. Scarlet clenched her teeth and thrust her spear at the disciple. A bolt of lightning flashed and drew a long arc along the edge of the spear. With a crackling sound, the arc of lightning crossed the distance of dozens of meters and leaped towards the disciple of the black flames. However, before the electric arc could reach the black-robed man, it was blocked by an invisible shield. Electric sparks flew in all directions, and the bark of the pine tree beside the disciple was immediately scorched black. However, the disciple himself did not move at all. Even the corner of his robe was not blown by the wind. A grade 2 magic weapon. How rare. The disciple clicked his tongue after a while. Scarlet's heart had turned cold. She took a deep breath and felt that her limbs were cold. But after a moment of fear, she felt anger rising from the bottom of her heart. She turned around and saw her companions pulling out their weapons and preparing to join the battle. She could not help but yell, "Run! What are you all doing?" Scarlet, leader you? The youths were stunned. Run. I'm not his match. Ask the leader to bring people to save me. That's a good plan. The disciple grunted and raised his hand. The monster in front of him immediately shot out another chain. This time the target was the youths. Damn it. Scarlet gritted her teeth and threw her spear at the chain. With a loud bang, the chain and the spear bounced off in opposite directions. Scarlet immediately raised her hand and a streak of lightning flashed between her and the spear. In the next moment, the spear flew back to her hand. It was as if the spear and the weapon were connected. Elemental resonance. The disciple screamed. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 153. That's what he said? Even though the Grey Wolves mercenaries were ambushed by the disciples of the Black Flames and the enemy mercenaries, they had no choice but to abandon their camp and retreat to the south. However, Maned Wolf, Makarov didn't panic in the face of danger. He calmly commanded the retreat and even gathered his men along the way to form a new fighting force. With that alone, he could be considered a famous general in this era. In the forest, as usual, he was with Buga wearing a fiery red military uniform. It was the uniform of the Royal Guard during the time of the previous king. Since Makarov was the captain of the Royal Guard, this uniform had been his symbol ever since. But after he left the army due to persecution, the uniform no longer had any epaulets, belts, or emblems. He pressed down on his own sword, the Type 35 cavalry sword, which was used by commanders. This type of sword was the most popular weapon for level 30 to 40 swordsmen in the game. Of course, it wasn't because it was very strong, but it was because it had a high price-to-performance ratio. This kind of sword could be said to have the best attributes among the magic longswords that were around level 30 and below brass. There were a lot of them circulating in the market, which was why it was so popular. However, Makarov didn't seem to be worried about the enemy's attack. Instead, he raised his eyebrows and his expression was calm. Only when he heard Yura's words did he raise his eyebrows and ask. Seeing Yura nod, Makarov turned to Buga and asked, "Xiangdong, it seems like that young man Brando has a card up his sleeve. Should we follow them?" Wait, Rady hurriedly interrupted him. Even though this white-haired young man was a mercenary, he had more freedom than the others. Normal people wouldn't dare to interrupt like this. "Leader, our opponent is the tree herders. Shouldn't we retreat first and think of a better plan? I think they must have come prepared since they are making such a big fuss. If we continue to fight them here, wouldn't we be playing into their hands?" His words were hurried and rushed, but Makarov and Buga were used to this young man's personality and didn't think much of it. However, Rady immediately thought of something and asked, "Oh right, Eek is still in town. Will he be safe? Makarov looked at the young man and nodded. You are right, Rady. But no one can guarantee that the Grey Wolves mercenaries will be safe once they retreat to Chablis. He saw Yura lowering her head and knew that she was worried about her lover. He sighed and said, in fact, the vice leader and I already knew that Conrad wasn't as simple as he seemed. But since we dared to lure him here, we should be prepared. I don't know what he discovered, but it's good for him to stay. Cabot is there to protect him. Don't worry. Buga remained silent as he listened by the side, but the tall swordsman was startled for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his head towards the direction of the forest. Immediately, a blinding flash of light appeared, followed by a deafening roar from behind the forest. Everyone's expression changed. Just as Rady was about to say something, one of the mercenaries exclaimed, "The seventh cord! Scarlet is in trouble." Buga unsheathed the great sword on his back, but he immediately let go of it and stared at the direction with a solemn expression. The battle is over. Scarlet, Yura's face paled. I'll go save her. Rady seemed to have only just realized what was going on. He immediately drew his sword and tried to rush in that direction. But Makarov grabbed him by the shoulder and stopped him from moving. Stop. Leader? Makarov didn't say a word and frowned for the first time. He looked towards the direction of the forest with a serious expression. Not long after, shadows appeared in the forest. Screams of pain could be heard from afar. It sounded like the cries of humans or beasts. The mercenaries who were at the edge of the forest quickly retreated. This was because a large number of disciples of the Black Flame sect had suddenly appeared in the forest in the southwest. As they moved forward, the heavy chains on their feet and hands rubbed against the ground and swept through the bushes, creating a clanking sound. At this moment, the quiet forest was particularly eerie. The north is just a feint. The enemy is lying in ambush in the south. At this moment, this clear thought flashed through everyone's mind. Unfortunately, it was a little too late to react. Scarlet and Rallel had obviously been defeated, but the mercenaries didn't have the time to grieve for the loss of their comrades. They were in the same danger. These were all experienced warriors, and they could tell at a glance that the enemy outnumbered them by at least 3-1. Rady gulped. Even though he wasn't afraid of death, he still felt suffocated in the face of such a situation. Even though Yura couldn't see, she knew how dangerous the situation was. Conrad. Buga spoke in a low but powerful voice. A frivolous voice immediately responded from the forest. It sounded like a young man. Mr. Buga, you know me? But should I call you Buga the Cross? Or should I call you Duke Anthony or Grand Duke Lone's personal guard? The members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries couldn't help but be startled. They turned around and looked at their vice leader in astonishment. Although they didn't believe him, it was hard for them to suppress their curiosity. Buga and Makarov were unfazed. Makarov raised his hand to stop Buga and said, I didn't expect the Paper Cards mercenaries to be working together with the infamous tree herders. It won't be good if word gets out. The forest immediately fell silent. There were many who knew about the disciples of the Black Flames, but not many knew about their relationship with the tree herders. The young man called Conrad didn't expect Makarov to know so much. He paused for a moment and mocked, as expected of the cunning fox of the past. You know quite a lot. As expected. Makarov furrowed his brows. He was trying to confirm Brendel's words. However, he wasn't worried that it would affect their morale. Mercenaries were different from regular soldiers. They were a group of fugitives and didn't care about life and death as much as normal people. That was why in Wond, even though the strength, equipment and discipline of the mercenaries couldn't compare to regular soldiers, they were still a powerful force. All right, Mr. Makarov. Conrad smiled and said, Actually, I'm here to confirm with you whether the only son of Grand Duke Lone is with you now. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were stunned again. They couldn't help but look at their leader. Why was there another duke? That was an unreachable figure in their eyes. Makarov laughed. What a joke. I don't even know what you're talking about. And even if I do you think I have the obligation to answer your questions as enemies? He couldn't help but mock. But the young man in the forest shook his head. You can't say that. Do you have the heart to see so many of your old subordinates who have followed you for more than 10 years die here? But he immediately nodded. That's right. They are nothing compared to your original identity. For your mission, it's only right to abandon these cannon fodders. Buga snorted. All right, Conrad. We are all mercenaries. Do you think your words will affect us mercenaries? Makarov shook his head. Why don't you give it a try and see if you have any skills? For our profession, the worst-case scenario is death. It's nothing. Maned Wolf's words caused the mercenaries to chuckle. It was because of this that people like them had already accepted life and death. To them, it was extremely laughable for someone like Conrad to be so hesitant and try to persuade them for half a day before the battle. Mercenaries had their own code of conduct. Their loyalty to a group was completely different from that of regular soldiers. Therefore, the other party's attempt to sow discord was laughable in their eyes. As if to express their thoughts, the mercenaries drew their swords and prepared for battle. The sound of metal clashing could be heard in the forest. On the other side, in the dark forest that blocked out the starlight. That damned old man. The young man called Conrad cursed. He glanced at the injured red-haired girl beside him and snorted. That old fox Makarov isn't easy to deal with. Too bad our target isn't him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered to waste my breath on him. Since we know he won't say anything, why don't we just kill him? A man covered in a black robe beside the young man said in a low voice. When he raised his hand, 2 red lines could be seen on his sleeves. If Brando saw this, he would probably run away immediately. This was a low-ranked priest of the disciples of the Black Flames. Compared to the high-ranked disciples, he was much stronger. We could have. But the Grey Wolves mercenaries still have 2 groups that we don't know where they are. We can't let our guard down. That bastard Makarov is known for his cunning. The young man said with a gloomy face. He knocked on a tree trunk beside him. That bastard left a group of people in Chablis. There's also that young man called Eek. It seems like he's putting on an act, but no matter how I think about it, it's just a shell to divert our attention. Who knows? The disciple of the Black Flames replied. Don't worry. I left a gold-rank swordsman there just to be safe. Even though that Capote hid his strength, his true strength is only SOSO. Then what are you worried about, Mr. Emissary? Conrad snorted in disdain. He crouched down and grabbed the girl's long red hair and pulled her head up. Fresh blood immediately flowed from the girl's forehead down her cheeks. Scarlet groaned in pain. She squinted her eyes, which were covered with scabs, as if she wanted to see who was in front of her. But when the young man exerted force, she immediately curled up in pain. Ugh! The young man laughed sinisterly. Of course it's the other group that went missing from the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Even though that group of 12 mercenaries, a young merchant and 2 women joined the Grey Wolves mercenaries midway, it's impossible for me to believe such a lie. Makarov must have made arrangements. But I can't pry open his mouth, and he can't guarantee that everyone in the mercenary group will be as stubborn as him. Is that so? He looked at the dying girl and asked, Little girl. Scarlet seemed to have just realized the situation she was in. She gritted her teeth and turned her head to the side. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 154. What? Not going to say? Conrad chuckled. He took out a dagger and patted the girl's face. Since the people who left are not your companions, why are you risking your life to protect them? The cold blade of the dagger reflected a soul-stirring light, as if it was a layer of ice that emitted traces of coldness. As if she could feel the coldness of the blade, the girl moved slightly. But she took a light breath and replied in a low voice, 1 word at a time. Not being able to defeat you is my own responsibility. My own matter. I alone am responsible. Only the weak will rely on putting others in danger to protect themselves. I am different from you. Her half-opened eyes seemed to be burning with flames as she answered. Is that so? Conrad was not angry. But I don't have much patience. You have to know that there are 70 to 80 people in the Grey Wolves mercenaries. Not everyone is willing to keep their mouths shut for strangers like you. They are mercenaries. I remember that mercenaries don't have to be so loyal. Since that's the case, the final result will not change. Why are you so stubborn? I don't take pleasure in killing people. That's why I'm giving you a chance. Little girl, you don't want to go to your weak Lady Martha and cry, right? Scarlet's eyelashes moved. The young man waited for her answer. But the girl only clenched her teeth and shook her head. Others are others. I am myself. That was her answer. Then we can only meet again, little girl. Scarlet tensed up at that moment. Her face turned pale. She was only an ordinary person. Even if she was a mercenary who was used to seeing life and death, she would still feel fear at the last moment. But this fear did not defeat her determination. She clenched her teeth and did not speak. Her hands were clenched into fists as if she had accepted her fate. 2 streams of tears flowed down from the corners of her tightly shut eyes. Conrad turned around. The dark bishop from the Blackfire sect who had been standing behind him nodded his head. It was just as Conrad had said. The Grey Wolves mercenaries were already in their hands. As for the captive, there was no need to care about this one. Moreover, according to the definition of a mercenary, although these desperados were willing to risk their lives in battle, they would not easily give up their lives for some meaningless perseverance. Makarov and Buga had to keep it a secret, but the others didn't. The 2 of them knew this very well. The young man picked up the dagger and stabbed towards the girl's chest. The dark divine priest of the Blackfire sect looked at this scene coldly, as if the blood that bloomed like a flower did not represent the passing of a life, but was merely a beautiful painting that was worth admiring. He heard a cracking sound coming from the red-haired girl's throat. Scarlet seemed to be trying her best to grab onto something at the last moment, but she suddenly opened her eyes. Her gaze gradually became empty and then lost its light. Her consciousness and strength were rapidly leaving her body, but at the last moment she couldn't help but wonder if that person knew that she was already dead. It turned out that life was so fragile. She suddenly felt extremely sleepy, but at the same time she felt someone put something on her chest. What is that? What is that? Conrad turned around and saw the dark divine priest of the Blackfire sect in a black robe place a dark red gem that emitted a faint light in the middle of the girl's chest. A few rays of light that resembled the roots of a plant extended from the gem, and the black light seeped into the wound below the dagger. The light then spread along the girl's blood vessels to her limbs, and soon, a layer of faint red mist covered the entire body. Blood of God, Lord Emissary. The dark divine priest answered simply. You want to awaken her into a spirit figurine? No. The dark divine priest shook his head. This woman was able to resonate with her weapon and had the ability to defeat our high-ranked disciple with the strength of a lower silver rank. This means that she has great potential. This potential comes from the fact that she already has such accomplishments at such a young age. The dark divine priest spoke with a hoarse voice under the cloak. I gave her the blood of thunder god Kabai. If she can awaken an emissary, then this gamble will be worth it. High-ranked divine blood? Conrad couldn't help but squint his eyes. How did you get it? A low-ranked dark divine priest like you shouldn't be qualified to receive such an item, right? It's just a coincidence. Luck is also important. Chaos is the law. The dark divine priest replied. The young man snorted lightly and looked down at Scarlet's body. The dark red light had already wrapped around her body into a cocoon of light. The failure rate is also high, he said. Then what we lose is just a high-quality corpse. The dark divine priest replied coldly. Suit yourself. I'm going to attack now. You better stand further away. Buga and Makarov aren't ordinary people. If they fight with their lives on the line, I'm afraid I'll lose half of my life. Conrad turned around and looked out of the forest. But even though he said that, his right hand, which was wearing a white glove, was still casually placed on the hilt of his rapier. The dark divine priest knew the importance of this mission, so he didn't refute and only lowered his head. He paused for a moment and looked up again. That group that left, is it really the real Eek? The probability is very high. Conrad walked out of the forest and answered without turning back. It doesn't matter anyway. No matter what, they won't be able to escape. If I want them to die, they will die. The dark divine priest sneered silently. In the quiet forest, the silence was quickly broken by a single sentence. So my lord already knew that Eek was the eldest son of Duke Anthony? Of course not, Miss Amandina. I only suspected it at first. Brando sighed and replied, but Miss Yura reminded me that she was Eek's fiancée. I've seen them once in the Black Tower, but I just didn't remember. Of course that wasn't the truth. Brando couldn't have seen them once in the Black Tower. But it didn't matter. He thought that no one would jump out to expose him anyway. And he wasn't completely lying. He really only remembered this matter after seeing Yura. Miss Yura wasn't a nameless person in history. She could be said to be the most famous astrologer in Erewhon. At the same time, her strength was also ridiculously strong. In the history of the Amber Sword, Brando clearly remembered that Yura was a chosen one, and her blindness from birth proved this point. The chosen one was a person who was favored by Martha, but mortals were mortals after all. Their flawed bodies couldn't accept such perfect power. Therefore, when the divine power was born, the body itself would be damaged. In the long history of Wond, there were only 2 chosen one who didn't have any physical defects. One was the hero of the Fire Kingdoms, one of the four saints, King of Flames Gretel. The other was born in this era, and now held the cold Mercury staff of Madara, the future emperor. Although most of the other chosen ones were famous, they still had their flaws. But at this moment, Yura could become a martial arts master in the future. She could even reach level 150 at her peak after activating her elemental power. She had helped Duke Lone, the Valkyrie, and the Princess Regent to stand on equal footing. Such a fact would only be treated as a joke if it was told. Could it be that her talent as a chosen one was awakened in this battle? Such a thought suddenly flashed through Brando's mind. He wanted to win over this future first-class powerhouse, but it was a pity that Yura had already fallen in love with Eek. Although Duke Anthony was still biased towards the royal family at this time, it was only a matter of time before they broke up. Brando calculated the date and found that he had neither the ability nor the time to change this matter. But he wasn't too worried. After all, Eek and Yura had contributed to the unification of Erewhon in the end. It was a pity that these two geniuses died young, and Yura left behind a daughter in history. He remembered that after the death of the Princess Regent and the Valkyrie, the girl named Ilara Lantanilan Ophelia had once led Aween's last resistance army. But at that time, Brando had already left the front lines of the war with Madara and joined the Church of Night Nation, Grace. Amandina listened to Brando's explanation, but still looked at him suspiciously. Is that so? The whole thing seems to be a fight between two mercenary groups, but it's actually a continuation of the war between the nobles. Maned Wolf, Makarov is Duke Lone's retainer? The entire Grey Wolves mercenaries are the bodyguards of that young man called Eek? Then what does the Paper Cards mercenaries want to do? Is it just an assassination? No, most of the people in the Grey Wolves mercenaries don't know about it, Brando said. When Duke Arek was in control of the court, almost all of Duke Lone's family members were killed in an assassination. You should know about this, right? Of course, the blood of the nobles dyed the coup that took place in the month. How could I not know about it? Amandina's eyes flashed. In fact, Duke Lone already knew about the assassination, so he sent his only son out before it happened. That's why he planned to use the deaths of others to cover for his only son. Brando took a deep breath and answered calmly. Amandina didn't say a word after listening to him. The struggle between the nobles was always so bloody, and from a certain point of view, Duke Lone's actions were understandable. Roman looked at them from not far away, but she didn't seem to be interested in this topic. So they're using their only son to threaten Duke Lone? Amandina thought for a moment and raised her head to ask. That's a sharp reaction, Brando praised. Duke Lone is still the strongest supporter of the royal family. If someone wants to make a move, they'll have to first shake this pillar of the royal family. So? Amandina frowned worriedly. Even though the chaotic situation was an advantage for them, as a citizen of the kingdom, she didn't want to see the worst happen. Less than 3 months. Brando answered. Did he already know about this? Amandina raised her head and asked. She suddenly realized something. He purposely lured the disciples of the Black Flames here. He wants to use the mercenaries as bait? I'm afraid so. The girl took a deep breath. Those were more than 100 lives, and according to Brando, they were his old subordinates who had been following him for at least 10 years. Even though she knew that only cold-blooded people could survive in such a cruel battle, she still couldn't help but feel her hands and feet go cold when she really came into contact with it. She suddenly glanced at Brando and could not help but think, does my lord think the same? However, Brando's gaze was still fixed on the valley below. He knew that there was a problem waiting for him to solve there. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 155. Brendel's gaze fell silently on the quiet valley below, and did not disperse. While the tree shepherds were inevitably plotting against them, he was also looking for a way to break out of the situation. Maned Wolf, Makarov had successfully deceived him, the tree herders, and even the players who participated in the plot. He had cleverly sent Duke Lone's only son out of danger. The cunning fox was a step ahead, but he was not easy to deal with after gathering enough information. He stopped and tapped his chin with his knuckles. He was confident that his wisdom came from the accumulation of experience from the previous players, and the wisdom of a group of people was always greater than that of a single person. The water was muddied, but the fish would not necessarily swim with the current. Makarov probably wouldn't have dreamt that there was an altar of order that had been abandoned for 200 years in this quiet northern forest. But just like what Brando said to Amandina, he was not the first to discover this altar. In the first era, before the year of separation, 100 years, Erwin and the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had discovered this altar. But in less than a century, this altar had mysteriously disappeared from all records, as if it had never existed in the first place. But players were still players, and those who participated in the plot only used a little bit of clues to uncover the entire story from the dusty history. But they probably did not expect that the series of investigations they did out of interest would end up benefiting Brando. Amandina probably noticed that her lord was distracted, and followed his gaze to the dense forest canopy below. But she did not discover anything even after looking for a long time. She turned back to look at Brando and noticed the seriousness on his face. She wisely did not speak again. She had guessed that if Makarov was willing to trap his own people, there was no reason why he would not drag them down with him. She snorted in her heart and subconsciously placed Duke Lone's faction in the list of unwelcome nobles. The group gradually descended into the valley. The two mercenaries of Lopez walked in front to clear the path. Their swords made a rustling sound as they chopped down on the branches. Occasionally the surface of the swords reflected the starlight, and the bright light dazzled everyone's eyes. He paid 2 wealth points from his storage to maintain the Mercenaries of Lopez card on the field. Then he checked the resources that he could use, including the 10 points of water EP that he had saved up in the past few weeks, as well as nearly 150 points of wealth. That was enough. He raised his head and narrowed his eyes. The young man saw that his summoned creature had stopped. The two mercenaries looked at each other, unable to believe what they saw. They stopped and turned back to look at Brendel. "My lord, what is it?" The Night Song Tiger asked sternly. These two mercenaries were the most inexperienced in his team, and he had intended to train them, but he did not expect their performance to make him feel ashamed. As he spoke, he strode forward and parted the shrubs in front of him, as if to make up for the mistakes of his subordinates. But in the next moment he was stunned. Behind the dense forest was an open grassland. The grassland was at least the size of 3 football fields, and a temple covered with vines stood quietly in the middle of it. The Night Song Tiger took a deep breath and raised his head. He could almost imagine how magnificent this majestic building was under the sun in the past, because even now, he could vaguely see the past glory of this temple through the dense foliage. Its structure was very simple. It was a cylindrical temple that rose up from the ground, and the arched roof shone with a white marble light under the moonlight. But its size made up for its simplicity. It was close to 60 feet tall, and it stood in the middle of the open space like the shadow of a giant. Brando stopped and looked at the exterior of the temple from the outside. From the style, there was no doubt that it belonged to the elven goddess. Unfortunately, the elven goddess had already turned into the stars in the sky according to her own will. What was left in this world was only their will and laws to change this world. The gods rarely interfered in the mortal world, and it was because of this that these noble existences were revered by the creatures on the ground. However, after losing the protection of the divine power, the temple inevitably lost its former glory. Brando saw that the southern part of the temple had collapsed, and he did not know how many years it had been since he last visited it. The merchant girl who came up from behind let out a small gasp. "This is..." Amandina was also stunned. "This is the Silver Elves' holy temple." Brando was used to seeing the magnificent and majestic buildings in the game. The elves, dwarves, and winged tribes were natural masters of architecture, and their cities were majestic and shocking. He was only dazed for a moment and recovered from the shock of seeing this temple for the first time. This was originally the royal tomb of the Silver Elves, and even after that, the humans did not renovate this place. Unlike the Forest Elves, the humans had always treated the Silver Elves as their strongest ally. This relationship had been maintained ever since the defeat of the Dark Dragon in the War of the Holy Saints. The commoners still had this understanding of the Silver Elves, which was why they were so precious. The royal tomb? Amandina turned her head. How did the royal tomb become an altar? Because the Silver Elven kings made a solemn oath when they were alive, and were willing to use their eternal lives to protect their homeland. After the elven goddess Shay communicated with Lady Martha, their heroic spirits were allowed to stay here forever. "A nest of heroic spirits?" Amandina asked. Brando nodded. "How did it get abandoned?" "On the surface it was because of the war. In reality, it was because the Elven Kings were unwilling to participate in the war between humans. Erwin's people almost angered Martha, and the truth of the matter was covered up. Brando looked back at Amandina and the Roman. You will not find a single record of this in any of the kingdom's documents. The two girls nodded in unison. They did not ask how Brando knew this, and they knew that the answer would be, the truth of the history recorded by the wizards. There's still room for this altar to be reactivated. Brendel's words shocked everyone once again. What? Don't get too excited, it's just a possibility. But only he knew that if the guide did not lie. The possibility of reactivation was 100%. But because of the restrictions of the storyline quest, the creatures that were created could only exist for 30 days. But 30 days was more than enough for the quest. Amandina and the Nightsong Tiger were excited after hearing Brando's words. This was a nest of creatures, and even if it was only a possibility of reactivation, the benefits behind this possibility were too great. This information was like a shining treasure chest in front of everyone. It could be filled with gold, silver, and jewels, or it could be empty. But in front of such a treasure chest, most people would not be able to remain calm. The Nightsong Tiger licked his lips and asked in a low voice, "What should we do, my lord?" Brando looked at them and pointed at the two mercenaries behind him. You two are elementalists, right? Yes, my lord. The two mercenaries nodded in unison. Do you have crossbowmen? Yes. The Nightsong Tiger immediately pointed at 4 people. Is that enough? Yes. Brando said as he took out a coil of rope from his backpack. 4 of you come with me, I'll arrange the battle strategy. Amandina frowned. Is there going to be a battle? Don't worry, it's just a small ghost night. Brando saw the Nightsong Tiger's face turn green when he finished speaking. He was surprised and asked, What's wrong? My lord, did you say, a small ghost night? The Nightsong Tiger asked with a strange expression. Brando coughed and remembered that the ghost knight was not worth mentioning, but it was a true level 35 elite undead. Even the guide had stated that there had to be at least 20 level 20 warriors in order to deal with the ghost knight. However, that guide was a product from before the Middle Ages of the game. By his time, the player's mindset had already changed. He had at least 9 out of 10 ways to deal with the ghost knight. Brando comforted the Nightsong Tiger. Don't worry too much, the ghost knight has a fatal weakness. Just listen to my orders and it won't be difficult to deal with it. The Nightsong Tiger looked at his lord doubtfully. If it was a normal mercenary he would have turned around and left already. Ghost knights were one of the scariest creatures in the legends of the wilderness. Rumor had it that they dashed through the forest like shadows under the moonlight, quietly taking away the lives of the living. Anyone below the level of a gold-tier swordsman was nothing but a piece of cake for them. Even if there were twice as many black iron-ranked mercenaries, they would still be slaughtered, not to mention the 12 of them. But this was also the reason why most people did not interact with these creatures. After all, they were not like players who could revive after death. They could use their lives to gain experience, and NPCs were naturally not as good as players in this aspect. But the Nightsong Tiger was still summoned by Brando, so he nodded. Amandina saw this and confirmed her suspicions about the Nightsong Tiger being a noble's retainer, but she did not point it out. Instead, she asked another question. Isn't this the Elven King's tomb under Martha's protection? Why would an evil spirit appear here? Brando snorted. In the past, the monks of the Holy Cathedral of Fire wanted to protect this lair, and tried to forcefully change the oath of the undead. In the end, the power of chaos took advantage of this and corrupted the altar of order, causing the evil spirit to appear. Legend has it that Martha was enraged by this and indirectly caused the Cipher dynasty to change. Amandina nodded. She did not expect there to be such a legend. My lord, are you talking about that? At this time, the mercenary who had been monitoring the temple suddenly turned around and pointed in the direction of the temple. Brando turned around subconsciously. P.S. I've been writing this chapter since yesterday and I've been in tears. I've finally gotten back to the dungeon. Half of the month has already passed, but the monthly votes are still far from half. I beg for everyone's support so that I can get a consolation prize. The pitiful person waiting for the money to go under the knife is on the verge of tears. Chapter 156. Under the moonlight, the rider looked like a translucent crystal statue, glowing under the fine dust. It held a silver spear in its hand and rode around the periphery of the temple. Then it disappeared from everyone's sight on the other side of the wall. The whole process was silent. But Brando was able to determine the general attributes of the ghost knight. It was a territorial monster. He immediately decided on his strategy. He turned around and saw 13 pairs of eyes with different colors. They were hesitant and nervous. The mercenaries, including the Nightsong Tiger, held their breaths as they waited for his command. Amandina covered her mouth with her hand and coughed twice. She then took a deep breath to calm herself down. But her brown eyes were bright like the stars in the sky. There was no fear or hesitation in her eyes. Her gaze was still on the direction of the temple. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He subconsciously paid more attention to the young lady to prevent her from sneaking out on a whim. To this egotistical fellow who called himself Lord Roman, this didn't seem to be something impossible. It was as if there was no danger in this world for her. There were times when Brendel could not help but wonder how his aunt, whom he had never met before, managed to raise Romain into such a character. A normal family would not have the ability to do so. But now was not the time to think about that. He turned around and said, "The strategy is actually very simple." He parted the shrubs and looked around. Then he raised his sword and pointed to the side of the hill. "See that Grimoire's black pine? You guys go there and ambush it. You just need to wait for me to lure it over." "That's it?" Everyone was stunned. "But what are we going to do, my lord?" The Nightsong Tiger asked doubtfully. Brendel glanced at him and thought to himself, "Do you still need people to teach you this? Since you've already entered the ambush, you don't have to be courteous." But this was the difference between the players and the natives. The players would not care about the consequences. They would just fight and think about it later. The worst that could happen was death. Therefore, he was startled for a moment and then answered matter-of-factly, "This, of course, with all his might." However, he suddenly realized where the problem was, so he simply changed to a simpler way of explaining. "All right, in other words, you can just take it that he has a grudge against you for stealing your wife and killing your son." "My wife and child?" The Nightsong Tiger paused for a moment and asked in confusion. "But my lord, to be honest, my wife died in the war with Cruz." Brando sighed and facepalmed. "Then you can treat it as if it owes your mercenary group 1,000,000 tor and does not intend to pay." Shock. Since the mercenaries of Lopez became famous, they had never heard of anyone who dared to delay their payment. There was a saying that cutting off one's livelihood was equivalent to killing one's parents. If they did not take revenge, how could they live under the same sky? The eyes of the mercenaries of Lopez turned red in an instant. The Nightsong Tiger gripped his axe so tightly that it creaked. He shouted, "Martha above, so it's the same as the untrustworthy Anju people. My lord, please do not worry. In the name of Lady Martha, we will beat the shit out of that undead who deserves to be cursed. We will teach it that it is not so easy to owe the Lopez people a debt." Amandina stood awkwardly at the side as she listened to the mercenaries' ramblings. As the daughter of a wealthy family in Bruglas, she did not have the chance to speak with such vulgar language. The profanities in his words almost made her faint, but she clenched her teeth and held on. She coughed and whispered with a red face, "Brando, the opponent is the legendary Ghost Knight. Can we really defeat it?" Amandina was not Brando's summoned creatures like these mercenaries. They could wholeheartedly trust him, but she still had doubts in her heart. Brando's plan was too simple. With such a simple method, wouldn't anyone be able to defeat the Ghost Knight? They were just a small group of ordinary mercenaries, and not all of them were sword masters, great wizards, sorcerers, or elven messengers. In the limited description of the Spectre Knight in the literature, the strength of the Spectre Knight was at least at the peak of the silver rank, close to the level of a gold rank knight. What were they going to use to fight against a quasi-gold tier swordsman? Was it just an ambush? However, the ambush would not increase their fixed combat strength. Or could it be that the purpose of hiding there was just to scare the enemy? Alright, even if this made sense, one had to consider that undead creatures wouldn't feel fear at all, right? Of course. Brando used a matter-of-fact answer to block her words. What? Amandina could not help but ask. "Don't worry, it won't attack us. To be exact, it can't hit us." "It can't hit us?" Amandina was tongue-tied. What kind of reason was that? Why couldn't the Ghost Knight be hit? Was it handicapped? Or was it that the knight was actually a pacifist? For a moment she could not help but feel a little angry. This was not a good time to joke, but she thought about Brando's glorious achievements. It seemed that even the most ridiculous things would become normal in front of him. But the most inconceivable thing was that every time it happened, it proved that he was right. Amandina suddenly felt that she should calm down. But she still could not control herself and complained in a small voice, I can't accept this kind of explanation." "I'm your aide, my lord." Brando shrugged. It was really difficult for him to explain. Because there were very few monsters that would patrol along a fixed route, this meant that the Ghost Knight had a very strong sense of territory. But in the game, this type of monster had another name, and that was Lord Monsters. These monsters had a common characteristic, and that was that they would wander around their fixed area. Once they touched the boundary of their territory, no matter what happened at that time, they would immediately turn back. This type of monster was extremely rare in the game, and because of this mandatory setting, it was easy for players to exploit the loopholes in the rules to kill monsters that were much higher level than them. That was why most of the Lord monsters were abnormally fierce, and most of them were long-ranged creatures. For example, the sealed black dragon in the Kenora Canyon, the Seven Dragons King Fuchsia Kath. Hound God Ogleister's teacher, the evil dragon that was nicknamed Master Craftsman by the players. Even though its ceiling area was only 3 miles, its attack range was as far as 100 miles. It was one of the strongest monsters in the northern Wound. The other type of monster was even more overpowered. It was a monster that could not be killed outside of its domain. For example, call the earthly spirit. But Brando also knew that there was a third type of Lord monsters. That was the quest boss that was limited by the storyline in the quest, so that a more powerful monster could reasonably appear in a lower level area, so that players of the corresponding level could have a chance to kill it. Obviously, this Ghost Knight was the last type. Of course, when the players who completed this quest for the first time wrote the guide, the players at that time did not have a deep understanding of the Amber Sword as they did later on, so they used a brute force approach in the guide. But in Brando's opinion, it was not that troublesome. But he was actually a little disappointed because even if he did, he would have a way to take down the Ghost Knight. But because the original setting was a plot kill, the equipment dropped by the monster would be reduced by 50%, and that was not just a little. Basically, it would completely reduce the portion of the overlevel reward, and even exceed it by a little. Brando did not know how this world was set up, but according to his original experience, it should not be far off. He lowered his head and looked at Amandina with his tea-brown eyes without blinking. In fact, he also knew the reason why the Ghost Knight could not be too far away from the temple. These evil spirits were born from the unyielding resistance of the ancient elven kings, but Martha sealed the altar before they had the time to rush out of their nest. In history, many of the Erewhon priests and monks died in that incident, so the royal family had been unwilling to mention this secret for many years. On the other hand, the sealed altar no longer provided magic, so the evil spirits naturally could not maintain it. It was just that this altar seemed to have a trace of life remaining, which prevented it from immediately disintegrating, but it could only hover around the temple. But it was simple to say, but to explain all of this involved the knowledge of the soul and the mana core. Brando was a player, so he could speak without restraint, but this knowledge was one of the core knowledge of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It involved the contract between humans and spirits, and was also the source of their power. He was not a highly accomplished theologian, and if he pretended to be a half-baked wizard with the identity of a Highland knight, it would be fine, but if he opened his mouth and said these things, even if Amandina was a puppet, she would suspect him. Moreover, the girl was so sharp. Maybe it's because I think that the Ghost Knight looks a little friendly, maybe it won't attack us? He finally thought about it and answered with a straight face. Lord Brando. Amandina took a deep breath. All right, Brando patted her shoulder. Don't be nervous, learn from the little Roman. Don't worry, when have I ever lied? Learn from the little Roman? Amandina could not help but look back at Amandina, who was looking at the direction of the shrine absent-mindedly, as if she was looking forward to seeing the Ghost Knight again. I think it's often. Amandina sighed and muttered in dissatisfaction. But she also knew that Brando had never said anything wrong, as if he could predict the outcome of everything. Brando smiled, knowing that she was convinced. He waved his hand to signal the others to move, and then borrowed a heavy crossbow from the Nightsong Tiger. When it came to luring monsters, a heavy crossbow was a treasure among the players. But the Nightsong Tiger looked at his actions and frowned, and could not help but ask, My lord, do you want me to lure the undead over? No need, I'm an expert in this field. Brando patted the heavy crossbow confidently, and the string creaked as if he was going to shoot the arrow ahead of time. The Nightsong Tiger's heart trembled as he watched from the side. Why does this young lord look like a layman? If not, he would not have made such a rude request. After all, in Wound, he would be suspected of looking down on his lord if he said such a thing. In this era where a noble's reputation was more important than their lives, this was a serious crime. But he couldn't just watch as his lord was sent to his death. Fortunately, Amandina could see the worry in the mercenary captain's eyes. She couldn't help but ask in a small voice, My lord, is there any problem? Brando looked at her strangely. What's the problem? Amandina choked on her words, but she did not immediately roll her eyes. But Brando smiled. All right, I know what you're worried about. But if there's a Ghost Knight crystal, I'll invite you to the most luxurious inn in Ampere Seal for once. Ghost Knight's crystal? The two of them were stunned. What's that? What does once mean? P.S. Thank you for everyone's support. Please continue to support us. Chapter 157. Brando smiled. Of course, you wouldn't understand the value of the Ghost Knight's crystal. This thing was once hyped up to 300 million tor in the Amber Sword. Until the middle of the Second Era, only a few warriors could afford to use equipment with the Ghost Knight's crystal engraved on it. However, it seemed like wishful thinking to want to get the engraved crystal. In other words, it was like the clouds floating in the sky. It looked beautiful, but it was meaningless. Because even Brando himself didn't take this sentence seriously. The engraved crystal was a product of the purification of a monster's own attributes. Could be dark, evil, flying, or floating. Any kind of engraved crystal only had a very small chance of being produced, not to mention the Ghost Knight's crystal. The drop rate was about 7 decimal places. The chance of getting this thing was only slightly higher than transmigrating to another world. He held up the heavy crossbow and asked, "Do you have any magic arrows?" Yes. The two elementalists in the mercenaries of Lopez immediately answered. The two girls were twins. Their long gray-brown hair was tied into thin braids beside their long ears. They were actually wild elves from the mountains of Orgash. When Brando became a member of the Divine Force in his previous life, he fought against the undead for a long time in Orgash. He was not unfamiliar with this race. The wild elves were actually the children of the goddess Gaia, so they were closer to the dwarves of the stone race. The two races often had the tradition of intermarriage, and their customs were also very different. However, the wild elves valued martial arts. They were rich in hunters, elementalists, and hunters. These three professions were all offensive professions. It was obvious that their culture was fierce. When the fourth king of Cruz, Longblade Harson, invaded the Lopez Principality, he suffered a great loss at their hands. Although he won in the end, he paid a heavy price. To this day, the people of Cruz and the wild elves were still hostile to each other. It was because of this fierce and open culture that many wild elves came to the human world. The profession they chose was also very fierce. Mercenaries. On this point, the Lopez mercenaries were the wild elves, mountain dwarves, and the Lopez mercenaries were the allied forces of the Lopez mercenaries. Therefore, Brando was not surprised to hear that there were 2 elementalists from the wild elves among the mercenaries. If there were 2 war priests, that would be the most shocking thing. The Lopez people and the Kurlutz people were sworn enemies that never interacted with each other. The war priests were elite priests trained by the Cruz people. The organization's predecessor was the Imperial War Missionary Society. The headquarters is the Holy Temple of the King, located in the mountainous highlands of the Haralai region. Every year, the Holy Temple produces a steady stream of young and excellent priests for the Empire, whose emblem is the eagle. My lord, which one do you belong to? The older sister with a sharper face and fairer skin asked in a sweet voice. Ice and wind, how many can you make? If I don't reserve my magic power, I can make 10. I can make 6. The younger sister replied in a crisp voice. That's enough, Brando interrupted them. Give me 7 of each and the remaining 2 will be guided arrows. The 2 sisters looked at each other with a strange expression. They looked at their captain. In the end, it was the older sister who asked softly, My lord, we can understand the wind-binding arrow and ice-rending arrow, but guided arrow. Guided arrow isn't usually used alone? They were not lying. Guided arrows were usually used to make expensive double or even multiple magic arrows. After all, high-level magic arrows were expensive and could not be recycled. However, a magic arrow would only be effective if it hit the target. For example, if someone missed a dragon-slaying arrow, it would be a huge loss. Thus, the so-called double magic arrow was born, also known as guided magic arrows. But they had never heard of a single guided arrow being used alone. It was not like the nobles used it to cheat when hunting. But Brando had other plans. He smiled. It's fine, you just have to do it. There's no need to conserve your mana. After completing my mission, you can rest at the back with Roman and Amandina. The rest of the battle will be left to the others. The older sister nodded. Even though she still had doubts, she knew that human lords were often obstinate and opinionated. So, the more mature elven girl wisely chose to keep her mouth shut. But her younger sister frowned and continued to ask, "But, my lord, Tia?" she shouted sternly. The younger sister looked at her sister in surprise. She understood her sister's meaning and kept her mouth shut. Brando was stunned. He could not help but think of the Shire. Sometimes it was hard to believe that these people with their own judgment, memories and emotions were life forms summoned from a card. If it was someone else, they would not be able to tell at all. But he smiled bitterly. Did he look like a cold and heartless lord? Even though he was a little stern in front of these mercenaries, it was only because of his personality. There was no need for such a big misunderstanding, right? He turned around and saw that Amandina was holding back her laughter. Roman was also looking at him with a smile as if they were watching a good show. "I say, am I still your lord? Your attitude is not right." Brando complained in his heart, but he still forced a smile on his face. "Don't worry about it," he replied with a dry smile. 14 magic arrows were quickly handed to him. In fact, according to Brando's strength when he was at his peak, he estimated that at most half of the arrows would be enough. But now was not the same as before. He was not a level 130 warrior, so he prepared as many arrows as he could. In any case, 2 elementalists with 2 rings, lower level iron ranked, would not be of much help in the upcoming battle. He inserted the arrows one by one into the buckles of his belt so that he could use them easily. Then he looked up and saw that the mercenaries in the forest were also in position. This made him feel a little more at ease. However, just as he relaxed a little, he became even more upset when he saw the face of the middle-aged man beside him, which was full of vicissitudes of life. "I said no problem. Captain Nightsong." Brando sighed. No matter how he explained, the Nightsong tiger was still worried about him. His reason was simple. Just like the Shire, he knew the relationship between them and Brando, so he would not let him take the risk. "It's fine, my lord. Just let me stay. I can revive even if I die, so you can just treat it as a shield." The Nightsong tiger replied calmly. "Why does this sound so familiar?" "Yes, I can revive, but I have to wait until tomorrow morning, and I have to pay an extra maintenance fee." Lord Nightsong Tiger. Brando listened to the Nightsong Tiger's explanation with amusement. He looked back at the forest and confirmed that the Roman and Amandina were far away. Then he asked, "They're all gone. Are you the only one among the 12 mercenaries who understands this?" The Nightsong Tiger nodded and did not deny it. Every summoning card has a core or a leader. Other than that, the others are called derivatives. In this card, I'm the core. The core setting can be said to be the Planeswalker's assistant, helping him manage the derivatives created by this card, or other cards or spells attached to this card. There's such a setting? Brendel paused for a moment before he thought of something else. If that's the case, then the knowledge that each core possesses is different. Of course, it's related to the card itself. The Nightsong Tiger replied. Then what do you know? Do you know how to get a card from the graveyard? He asked jokingly. Black cards are mysterious and unpredictable. If my lord wants to use the graveyard tactic, I'm afraid you'll need to collect a dark elemental land card. This type of land card can be found in swamps, graveyards, or places where undead creatures gather. The Nightsong Tiger replied. Brendel nodded, took a deep breath and looked ahead. He raised his heavy crossbow. Then you stay here. Just don't cause trouble for me. His gaze swept across the temple that stood alone under the cold moonlight. It had been 2 centuries since Erwin's people left this place, and no other intelligent beings had entered this ruined temple. He calculated the time as he thought about these irrelevant things. In the past games, luring monsters was a skill. A true expert could make his opponent appear in a desired location along the path he had planned. 4 low-level AIs, he needed to remember the opponent's judgment. 4 high-level monsters, it was a battle of the hearts of the people. Brando did not neglect any of these things. Although he was not a hunter in the past, he did not have a complete team. As a warrior, this was one of his jobs. 8-7, Brando muttered softly. The mercenary captain obviously did not understand what he was calculating. After all, the way the NPCs fought was different from the way the players fought. For the players, no matter how real the world was, it was still a digital world. Everything was written using numbers. Brando was the same. Their thinking was beyond the game, and they were like a precise machine that recorded every change in the numbers. Everything followed a pattern. He calculated the time and pulled the trigger. The first arrow installed on the crossbow was a hollow whistling arrow. It immediately let out a sharp cry and flew out. The hollow arrow drew a white stream of air on both sides and drew an arc as it drilled into the shadow of the temple. 6, 5. The sharp screech alerted the hostile undead, and the glowing knight appeared at the side of the temple. The Nightsong Tiger placed one hand on the handle of his flying axe and tensed up. But Brando immediately threw away the crossbow and took out his own short bow. He had bought this bow when the Highland Squire card entered the graveyard. Although it was not as good as the Shire's construct bow, it was better than nothing. Brando signaled to the Nightsong Tiger. Retreat now. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 158. The Spectre Knight had already noticed the commotion. It silently turned its horse around and pointed its spear at Brendel. The air in the dark was like a layer of ice that was wrapped in a layer of fog, forming a vacuum zone. Brando immediately pushed the Nightsong Tiger away and rolled to the other side. Asterisk bang. Asterisk bang. Asterisk 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 asterisk bang. The Spectre Knight let go of its spear, and a 10-foot wide path appeared in the middle of the forest. Brando and the Spectre were no longer obstructed. Spectre's spear. Fuck. Did it have to use its ultimate skill right from the start? Brando could not help but curse. He wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. He was thankful that he had seen the Spectre Knight raise its right hand and knew that something was wrong. The Spectre's spear had the ability to pierce through armor, and like his White Raven sword, it had the ability to increase its attack range. If they had not dodged in time, he and the Nightsong Tiger would have been left with two cold corpses. The Nightsong Tiger was also nervous. He had only heard of the Spectre Knight in legends, but now that he was facing it, he realized that it was much more difficult to deal with than he had imagined. The Nightsong Tiger could not help but spit on the ground. He was almost middle-aged, but he still had to fight like a child. The world was changing fast. He could not help but look at Brando, but he saw that the young man was unfazed by the Spectre Knight's attack. The Nightsong Tiger could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. We can't beat it. The Nightsong Tiger was an experienced veteran mercenary, and he could tell the difference between the enemy and himself in an instant. He then shouted at Brando from the other side. But Brando only signaled him to be quiet. He raised his short bow with both hands. The young man could now clearly see the terrifying Spectre's appearance. It looked like a classic knight from Wone's paintings. It was covered in a layer of Gothic armor, and its entire body was covered in a layer of hazy light. Even the warhorse it was riding was no exception, but it was not a horse but a spectre. The knight's spear was like a long silver spear. It held the spear tightly in its hand, and the tip of the spear was pointed towards the ground. It was an illusion caused by the spectre's elemental essence. After coming into contact with the gold rank, be it warriors, mages, knights or other professions, they all began to more or less display the power of elemental powers. The Nightsong Tiger crawled up from the ground and tried to stop Brendel's next move, trying to pull him back. In the eyes of this mercenary captain, his lord, or rather his summoner, was simply crazy. They were no match for that monster at all. The power displayed by the Spectre Knight had far exceeded his understanding of the ordinary low-level gold-level powerhouses. But Brando turned a deaf ear to his shouts. The young man knocked a silver arrow, took aim and released the arrow. The arrow flew over the Spectre Knight's head in a stunning arc and exploded behind it. However, the silver ice mist only brushed past the Spectre Knight's left shoulder and formed a layer of white frost. Brando could not help but blush. He coughed to cover up his embarrassment. He just remembered that he only had weapon mastery and was no longer a level 40 archer. Even so, the Spectre Knight's movement was slowed down by the frost arrow. Although it was limited, the Spectre Knight's spear still missed its target, and a streak of silver light flew over their heads. The Nightsong Tiger turned around and saw the canopy of the trees behind him disappear, leaving behind only a bare tree trunk. He opened his mouth, unable to breathe. The mercenaries of Lopez were brave and good at fighting, but this battle was beyond his understanding. Was this guy a walking cannon? 3 seconds. Noticing that the Nightsong Tiger did not care about his archery, Brando breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, his fingers once again knocked the bowstring of his short bow. The spirit spear consumed a lot of soul fire, and the Spectre Knight would enter cooldown after using it twice in a row. This was not the first time he had fought against this kind of undead, so he was well aware of the situation and could calm down. Brando straightened his short bow and extended the aiming time. The Nightsong Tiger thought that this action was no different from courting death, but Brando was like a statue. He only had 3 seconds. The second Frostburst arrow missed, and the third Frostburst arrow hit the Spectre Knight's waist. After the silver ice powder exploded, half of the Spectre Knight's body was shrouded in a gray mist. Brando saw that he had dealt 13 points of damage to the Spectre Knight. The damage was negligible to the Spectre Knight, but the frost on its armor increased the delay of its attack by 12.5%. The effect of the frost arrow was the same as what he remembered. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. Although the Spectre Knight was a spirit, its magic arrows were not physical attacks, so there was no penalty for losing them. It was a pity that the Elementalist Sister's levels were too low, or else the Spectre's attack speed would be reduced by at least half. But it was enough. He still had 4 arrows in his hand. It's actually effective? The Nightsong Tiger's eyes were sharp. Although he could not see the data as clearly as Brando, he could still see the clues as soon as the Spectre Knight slowed down. Nonsense, Brendel said in annoyance. He knew that this bastard would only drag him down if he stayed. But even so, we are still not its opponent, my lord. So, let's retreat. Compared to this guy, I'd rather fight the disciples of the Black Flames. The Nightsong Tiger shouted. Brando ignored the Nightsong Tiger and threw another bundle of green magic arrows to the Nightsong Tiger. The Nightsong Tiger caught it subconsciously and asked, "What are you doing?" "Nonsense, of course it's to help me. What are you doing here?" Although the Nightsong Tiger did not know what Brando meant, he could guess that Brando was dissatisfied with his previous performance. The Nightsong Tiger's face turned red, but he could not help but complain in his heart. He thought to himself, "Do you think everyone is the same as you, Sir Lord? To be able to face these terrifying human-shaped cannons without batting an eyelid, I don't know if this is audacious or foolish." But even so, the Lopez mercenaries who had been mercenaries for generations still worshipped courageous and valiant warriors. As for his summoner, he didn't say it out loud, but in his heart he was convinced of his strength. At this moment, Brando had already fired his 4th frost arrow in 3 seconds. This one hit the Spectre Knight's right shoulder and caused a thick layer of ice to form on its armor. The efficiency of the Spectre Knights had been reduced by more than 30%. Most people would have been happy to beat the Spectre Knights when they were down, but the young man did not say a word. He just dragged his mercenary leader and ran away. As soon as he left, the Spectre Knight and its mount turned around and sped up. This was not a normal pursuit, but a common skill used by knights and warriors, charge. Brando also activated charge. The man and the undead were like a black line and a silver line chasing each other in the forest. Although it was only for a moment, the scene was so beautiful that it was almost strange. It was as if on a still dark canvas, an eye-catching silver-white line extended infinitely along a black line. The picture was still, time was still, and everything was still, but the 2 lines kept moving forward. One was chasing and the other was escaping. When Brando stopped, the Nightsong Tiger was almost speechless. "My lord, that is charge, a knight's skill. As a veteran of the mercenaries of Lopez, don't tell me you don't know this?" Brendel glanced at him. "No, I mean, my lord, how did you know it would use charge at that time?" "Ah, I was in the mountains of Orgish. The main opponent of the hunters was the Spectre Knight. Didn't I tell you this story before?" Brando answered absent-mindedly. He was so nervous that he did not even know what he was talking about. It was a battle where he could lose his life if he was not careful, and to be honest, his heart was pounding with fear. He looked back and saw that the Spectre Knight had stopped almost at the same time. The elegant, almost pure, beautiful monster tightened its reins with its long silver-armored gloves, and 2 pale flames lit up under its mask as it looked in Roland's direction. The look in its eyes seemed to be a question. "Who are you? You seem to be a difficult opponent. Where did you come from?" The distance between the 2 of them was about 100 meters, but now it was less than 50 meters. Brando found that his estimation was not more than a meter off. He was almost relying on his instincts to fight. A warrior's instinct. In fact, it was not only the Nightsong Tiger who did not believe his words. When the 2 straight lines separated the forest into 2, Amandina could not help but gasp in surprise. The mercenaries behind her were silent. Brando and the Spectre Knight's actions and judgments were exactly the same, as if the latter's every move could not escape the former's eyes. In fact, It took almost a second for them to realize how dangerous it had been before they realized what had happened. The Roman pursed her lips and looked in the direction of the battle with a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. If the younger generation of Karsuk's Highland Knight were all like this, then Erewhon would be one of the strongest countries in the world. Amandina took a short breath. This liar? But in reality Brando was not as optimistic as she was. The Spectre Knight's speed was fast and its charge still had a cooldown of 1 minute. Its soul fire was also burning brightly, and its ultimate skill was far more than that. The young man stopped and gestured to the Nightsong Tiger to follow him. The two of them quickly made their way to the center of the valley, where rocks intersected with each other to prevent the Spectre Knight from using his horse. However, Brando did not retreat blindly. The effect of the Frostburst arrow was to buy him time. Now he needed to use the time that he had bought. Nightsong Tiger. Yes. Use Wind Arrow. What? Brando made a gesture, and the latter was stunned for a moment before he understood what he meant. Although this mercenary captain had always been against fighting this monster, at this moment he seemed to have subconsciously integrated into this battle. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 159. The Phantom Knight raised its spear for the third time, but its speed was significantly reduced. The Nightsong Tiger took the opportunity to shoot an arrow before the Phantom Knight could attack. The azure wind-binding arrow landed right in front of the Phantom Knight. The azure light around the Phantom Knight dissipated, and a layer of azure wind surrounded the Phantom Knight's hooves. The binding effect was in effect, and the Phantom Knight and its Phantom Warhorse slowed down. -12.7%. Brando looked at the damage dealt to the Nightsong Tiger when he saw the damage dealt to the Phantom Knight. He couldn't help but look at the Nightsong Tiger. The arrow was extremely accurate, and the binding effect was almost fully unleashed. Even though the Phantom Knight did not move at full speed, its trajectory was not something a steel-ranked player could capture. That meant the Nightsong Tiger was relying on his intuition. The mercenaries of Lopez really lived up to their reputation. Brando immediately grabbed the mercenary captain and retreated. The Phantom Knight's attack landed on their original position. Even though its speed was reduced by 10%, it was still much faster than Brando and the Nightsong Tiger. The only thing they could rely on was the distance between them. Distance was equivalent to time. The wind-binding arrow and ice-rending arrow had a duration of more than 5 minutes, unless they were dispelled. Even if low-level spells had a penalty on high-level targets, Brando was sure that the effect would last for more than 2 minutes and 20 seconds. They were less than 50 meters away from the ambush location. After the Ghost Knight missed its target, it immediately thrust its spear forward. The tip of the spear seemed to create a point of gravitational collapse, and the air around the spear made a sonic boom, causing the space to distort visually. The surrounding trees immediately leaned towards the center and snapped in half, as if a storm was being sucked towards the center. Brando looked back and saw the Nightsong Tiger's movement. The Phantom Knight's signature move was the Phantom Knight's signature move. In the early stages of the game, many players had lost their lives to the Phantom Knight's skill, but this time, it was not enough to scare him. He dragged the Nightsong Knight into the intersecting rocks in the forest and used his energy drain skill. A green card flashed and the Phantom Knight's body shook violently, dealing 300 damage to himself. Brando could not help but laugh wildly in his heart. He had not guessed wrong. Energy loss was indeed effective against this move. The Ghost Knight's Thousand-Man Strike was actually a soul spell. Although it was powerful, the players later discovered that it was actually very easy to avoid it. As long as there was a barrier sorcerer casting a stagnation barrier or an elementalist casting a binding curse, this spell would be nullified. Since Energy Drain was a counterattack spell, he thought it might be effective against this move. He didn't expect it to be so. The Ghost Knight's attack had taken away almost a third of its HP. According to the settings, it would enter a stun state for about 2 seconds, and then enter a state of full combat. However, this type of high-level undead had considerable intelligence. After suffering a loss, it would definitely not use the Thousand Army Strike again. Therefore, Brando did not have to worry about it continuously using big moves. 2 seconds was not a problem for an Iron Rank player to run 50 meters away. When the Ghost Knight recovered, Brando and the Nightsong Tiger were already panting as they waited for it at the preset ambush location. Everything that happened before was done under the limit. Even with Brando and the experienced mercenary captain's stamina, it was still a bit difficult. However, the Nightsong Tiger knew that the Ghost Knight was far from using its full strength. He could not help but sweat profusely as he looked at Brando, trying to figure out how this planeswalker could reverse the difference in strength. It was not only the Nightsong Tiger who was thinking this, everyone present had the same thought. In fact, when the elementalists saw the Ghost Knight's first attack, they could not help but shiver. This level of battle was beyond their imagination. Although the mercenaries of Lopez were known for their bravery and fighting prowess, it was like a battle between mortals. Above the mid-level of silver rank, the way of battle had long surpassed the common understanding of ordinary people. There was a famous incident in the Amber Sword. It was a battle caused by players that happened in Cruz's city of Baility at the end of the First Age. There were 11 gold-ranked players who participated in this battle, and it resulted in the destruction of half of the city of Baility, which had a population of 500,000. Although these players could not escape the fate of exile in the end, the destructive power of high-level players was vividly displayed in this incident. Of course, after that incident, every country strengthened the management of adventurers, but this was a story for later. The Ghost Knight's next attack made even the knowledgeable Amandina speechless. The power that seemed to be able to see through everything seemed to be able to distort nature. Although it was just an illusion, it still made people feel despair. The younger elementalist could not help but tremble. Her elder sister hugged her tightly, and the two of them gritted their teeth and persevered. This was also the mercenaries of Lopez's perseverance. If it was a normal mercenary, they would have run away by now. The rule of mercenaries was to keep their promises, but they were still humans. Everyone held their breaths. But a miracle seemed to have happened at this moment. After the Ghost Knight charged to a certain spot, it seemed to have an invisible line there, and it suddenly stopped. The undead raised its head, and its glowing eyes looked through the mask at the people in front of it. It raised its hand and waved its spear, creating two invisible gusts of wind. The gusts of wind plowed two deep trenches in the ground, and the black pine trees that could be seen everywhere suddenly swayed. But it was a pity that the gusts of wind disappeared before they could touch Brando and the Nightsong Tiger. What is this? The mercenaries saw the Ghost Knight stopping behind the invisible line, and waving its spear futilely in an attempt to kill their lord and captain, but it proved that its efforts were futile because it could not reach them. At that moment, these people almost thought that it was as if God was helping them, and that it was Martha who was protecting their lord from the heavens. Even Amandina's eyes shone with a strange light, but she paused for a moment, and the light turned into doubt. The Roman clasped her hands together and let out a sigh, and a smile appeared on her face. She thought to herself that her Brando was the best. "Auntie, look, even the little Roman has an excellent lover." The mercenaries cheered, and even the Nightsong Tiger looked at him in disbelief. But Brando did not relax at all. He had guessed correctly, and the Ghost Knight's range of activity was indeed in this position. In fact, it was not difficult to guess, and it could be guessed based on the patrol radius of the monster lord. The Ghost Knight's patrol radius was pitifully small, and it was a storyline monster, so its range of activity was even more limited. In fact, there was a formula for this, but Brando had never memorized it, and he could only rely on his experience. He made a gesture to the people behind him. Everyone entered the Ghost Knight's attack range. Everyone was stunned. "Isn't this good? We can hit it, but it can't hit us." Almost everyone thought so, and some of them could not help but take out their crossbows, as if they were afraid that their lord had forgotten that they had the ability to attack from a distance. "My lord?" The Nightsong Tiger could not help but say. "Listen to my orders." Brando interrupted him. Things were not that simple. If the Ghost Knight could not reach them, it would quickly turn back. Even though it was a quest monster, it was not stupid. Under his insistence, even though the mercenaries were unwilling, they still followed his orders and entered the Ghost Knight's attack range. Fortunately, with the slowing effect of the frost split arrow, this terrifying undead creature's attacks became predictable. These experienced mercenaries were able to dodge a single gust of wind pressure. Brando knew that as long as it did not use the Thousand Army strike, even if the mercenaries of Lopez were in its attack range, it would not be able to do anything to them. It could only wave its spear in vain to show its presence. The mercenaries quickly realized this as well. Thus, the battle scene became very comical. The Ghost Knight was like a game of whack-a-mole, and the mercenaries were really like a group of rats, dodging around and occasionally retaliating with their ranged weapons. The only difference was that the Ghost Knight could never hit its target, and the mercenaries did not care about their image. As long as they could survive, it was enough. The Nightsong Tiger was stunned by the scene. If the Ghost Knight's terrifying strength was beyond his understanding, then the strange battle between the two sides had once again exceeded his understanding. He had been in the battlefield for decades, but he had never seen such a battle. Brando saw the Nightsong Tiger's expression and felt a little proud. He knew that in the past only a few people could decide the outcome of a battle. Knowledge was in the hands of a few people, and thus the thinking of war tended to be fixed. But he was different. He came from a more civilized world. At least half of his soul was like that. In that highly civilized society, universal education allowed everyone to have the right to think. Endless creativity allowed the players to develop endless tactics in this virtual world. In the era he lived in, there was a famous saying in the gaming industry: the more free the rules, the more difficult it was for the players. Players were always looking for ways to solve problems once and for all. They did not adhere to the rules, and used all the resources and advantages available to them to defeat the enemy. Brando was confident in this point. It was as if he represented the wisdom of the entire human race. Looking at this world from a different height, it was a world full of suffering and struggling to move forward in the darkness. He did not say anything and handed the remaining frost arrows to the Nightsong Tiger. He believed that the old mercenary knew when to use the debuff on the Ghost Knight. The frost arrow was one of the most commonly used magic arrows, and the mercenaries of Lopez should know how to use it. The mercenary captain was stunned. "My lord. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.